Yeah. Sure. The the cure will be like it's better than fall semester care. It will send administration. So long as nothing that kind of yeah, it exploded right and this is these you were yeah, yeah, and another those is a little spike up in the first
In the room.
but again, that
Hey, everybody, I'm wondering whether it's possible your classmates may have logged on to the link that we usually use for discussion groups. So let's just give them another minute or so, and hopefully we'll see a bunch of folks arrive. If not, I'll have to go into that room and try to fetch people. There is a discussion today, absolutely, but it is not until 4:30. So we will switch over to the discussion link at that time. But we're not starting there because we've got 2.5 hours of lecture first. So we'll be recording the lecture here, and then we'll move people into the discussion groups when we get to that point of the class period. I can answer your question out loud, Haley, and we have discussions both today and on Thursday. They occur at a different time during each class period. So the last one we had was at the beginning of class. Today's will be toward the end of class. So we're going to record the lecture here in the big room, and then when we get to the point of the class period today where we break into the discussion groups, we will use the link that our TA Jillian has created for us so that you guys can break into the usual groups. And so I'm recording now, and this will be our lecture for today, and we'll archive this for everyone. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We'll probably have several of your classmates popping in, coming in from the other room in the next little bit here. But let me share my screen and let me make sure that all of you can see the screen. So I'll ask one of you to just let me know if it's visible to you once it comes on the screen. Okay, is everybody able to see?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get us started. We've got actually quite a bit we're going to do today. Our new topic today is sexual assault and consent. We will get into that within the first hour, but we've got some material to come back to from Tuesday of last week. Last week we talked about gender and sexuality across the lifespan, and then toward the end of the class period, we're going to apply some of that lecture to couple relationships. And rather than rushing through at the end, I went ahead and postponed that, and we'll start with that today. Then we will talk just briefly about the kids video for any of you who may have had a chance to watch that last week. And from there, we'll move into the new material on sexual assault and consent. There will be a video prompt, about a 30-minute video that we'll watch together today to trigger the discussion groups. And then finally, discussion group number 3 will be toward the end of the class period. So quite a bit of different things that we'll be doing today, but it should help class to move quickly and maintain your interest. So we'll start with the conclusion of the content from last Tuesday, focusing on communication and relationships. And remember at the very beginning of the semester, telling you a little bit about my background. So I am not a sexologist or an expert in human sexuality. I've been teaching this class for, I guess, about 30 years now. Ordinarily, courses in the psychology department would be taught by psychology professors, but none of them really had the background and experience in human sexuality to feel equipped to teach the class. And so I took it on, not because I'm a sexologist, but because I'm trained in couples therapy. And so sexual relationships will often come up quite a bit in couples therapy. So this is an area that I do work in. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and a lot of the work I do is couples work. So I'll be focusing on some of that in the lecture today, and I'll conclude the lecture today with a couple of tips that are helpful for any couple in any relationship, and hopefully there'll be a little takeaway for you that might be useful to you in your own lives or with friends or folks that you know. So looping back to gender, which we talked about a week ago. We didn't do a deep dive on some of the main theories about gender identity, but for 100 years, Freud's theory was the primary theory that guided the field in terms of how we thought about children's acquisition of gender identity. And Freud, for those of you who have had other psychology classes may know, had a very complex theory where he talked about same-sex identification occurring during the Oedipal period. He described several periods of development. The Oedipal period was the period during the preschool years. So the oral stage was infancy, the anal stage were the toddler years, and then in preschool, children became very interested in establishing their identity, including their gender identity. And Freud believed that there was a crisis wherein children developed romantic feelings toward their opposite sex parents. So little boys fell in love with their moms, little girls fell in love with their dads, and they had rivals for mom and dad. So the little boy's rival for mom was father, and the little girl's rival for dad was mother. And so this created a conflict for the child who felt romantic feelings toward mom, but couldn't have mom because there was a more powerful dad who was already in a relationship with mom. This is Freud's theory. This was the guiding theory for 100 years in psychology. And so in order to resolve this crisis, the little boy became like dad so that he and dad together could take care of mom. And so this was the way that boys established their gender identity, and a similar process for girls in their establishment of their gender identity. So we now understand that factors are way more complicated than Freud's day. The Oedipal crisis doesn't really have any kind of empirical evidence. I think most psychologists have dropped that theory. Psychologists have not dropped the idea that during those preschool years, children are searching around for role models in terms of their gender identity, but not through the process that Freud described. Chodoroff was Nancy Chodoroff, who was actually a sociology professor here at UC Berkeley, was one of the first people to take on Freud and his theory. Freud's theory was that if a little boy won the Oedipal crisis, that is, if the family divorced during the preschool years, and there was no dad for the boy to identify with, or if dad was to die, or if for some reason dad was in the picture, and the boy won the Oedipal conflict, then the boy would not have a male role model, and the little boy would become gay. His gender, his sexual orientation would be that of same-sex attraction. So this was, again, in psychology, and it's an apology because psychology had it very wrong for 100 years. But for a very long period of time, this was the theory about sexual orientation, that there was not a strong male role model for boys, a strong female role model for girls, and it impacted their sexual orientation. And sexual orientation and gender identity were also very confused for a very long period of time in the field of psychology. When Chodoroff came along, she said, well, there's some real serious problems with this theory. And if the theory was taken at its face value and at merit, then you would expect that every fatherless boy in America would be gay. And in fact, that's not the case. Fatherless boys, children who grew up without dads in the home, are no more likely to be gay than are boys who grew up with a dad in the home. So the theory had some problems on the face of it. But Chodoroff had a very interesting alternative theory, and it went something like this. When children are born, they are literally connected to their moms through the umbilical cord, certainly emotionally connected to their moms, sort of tactile touch in terms of nurturance from their moms, breastfeeding, and so forth. So children have this inherent connection with their moms. And as Chodoroff explained it, in order for little girls, baby girls, toddler girls, preschool girls, to develop their gender identity as a girl, as a female, as someone like their mom, they didn't need to do much of anything. They could stay connected to their mom, and that close emotional connection with mom was at the core of their identity, that sense of connectedness. For a boy to develop his gender identity, what he needed to do was to step away from mom, to be different from mom, to be unlike mom. And so at the core of the little boy's identity was a sense of separateness. And this is not to say that little girls don't have a sense of separateness. They like being independent, like doing things on their own. It's not to say that little boys don't like connectedness. They love their moms. They love their dads. They love their sisters and brothers. They love people. So it's not about love, but it's about being different from mom is the way I establish my identity of being a boy. Being like mom is the way I establish my identity of being a girl. So these two terms, separateness and connectedness, are very, very important in the core sense of being a boy or being a girl, according to Chodoroff. And we're going to loop back to this several times over the next half hour or so, because Chodoroff's theory is one that is more respected than is Freud's theory at this point in the history of psychology. And the sense of connectedness being at the core of girls' identity and separateness being at the core of boys' identity is one that has a lot of research support for it. And so we talk a little bit about that. And first we'll talk a little bit about differences in the communication styles of cisgender boys and girls. And I use cisgender here as a qualifier only because we don't have a large enough research base yet to truly understand in the detail that we need to the normative development of transgender children. And so the overwhelming majority of research, way more than 99% of the research, is on the gender identity of cisgender boys and girls and differences in their communication styles. So we'll focus on that primarily because we're drawing on the research base, not because there's not a whole lot to learn in terms of where this is applicable and not applicable to transgender children, but rather to kind of speak to what we do know and what we have evidence for from the research literature. So as we look at and what I'm going to talk about here are average or prototypical styles. This does not apply to every boy. This does not apply to every girl. This is sort of normatively on average across different cultures what we see. So I've deliberately chosen a lot of the imagery that you're going to see on the slides today And part of the choice goes into what we see when we watch small children interacting in groups of same-sex peers. So these images should not should have come as a surprise to many of you who have ever spent any time with little boys on playgrounds and at preschool. And if you have younger brothers, or if you are a brother who has a brother, the rough and tumble play is something that is observed more commonly, more frequently in the interactions of young boys than in young girls, globally, cross nationally, in different cultures. It's not that all of boys' play is like this. It's not even that most of boys' play is like this, but this is a unique feature of play that you see predominantly among boy groups. Little girls like rough and tumble play as well. You often see kibitzing around like this with girls as well. So nothing I say today should be taken as an absolute or a standard. What I'm talking about is mean group differences. So as we look at group differences in the play of boys and girls, we do tend to see more physical activity, more roughhousing, more action, more physicality in the play of boys. And in the play of girls, we tend to see at different ages more communication through verbal means. Little boys talk to each other. Of course, they talk to each other. They're chatting all the time and they're having conversations. But in terms of intimate conversations, connectedness, communication, the closeness that little girls feel to each other is often in dyadic relationships with other best friend girls, where there's secrets and there's lots of talk and there's lots of emotion sharing. So once again, I don't want to pigeonhole and stereotype. I'm not saying that little boys don't, have these kinds of conversations with their best buddies as well. But as you look at group differences, there is more of this type of communication that happens in the interactions of best friend girls. All right, so that's like premise number one: observational studies of boys and girls across different cultures, some of the average differences that you see in the quality of play and interaction that they share. What's also interesting is that these communication styles are not limited to children. They enter into young adulthood. So as you watch the communication styles and activities of best friend young men and best friend young women, you often find that the physical interactions, the distance interactions, the kinds of not rough and tumble necessarily, but sort of competitive interactions, the being with is maybe a good way to say it. The being with best friends with males, it's qualitatively different than the being with of best friend females as young women, where there is more of the close one-on-one intimacy, sharing, connectedness that you would see in the interactions of little girls as they were growing up. So again, you've got preferred individual differences in styles of communication. There are best friend men who go into deep emotional conversations with each other about their feelings, or best friend girls who, really enjoy, sort of just physicality and games and not talking to each other. So, everything goes, everything's a possibility for young people, but you do tend to see similar styles of interaction that were present during childhood carrying over into the young adult years. So there's greater comfort, you might say, in the interactions of best friend males, best friend females with one another in cultures that they know and understand well, because they sort of lived through those kinds of interactions for, a couple of decades. This is what they know well, and this is what they sort of tend to fall back on in their relationships. Other research, quite interesting, came out of Stanford University. Eleanor Maccoby, in a widely cited study in the field of psychology, did a study of children who went to an observatory in Palo Alto and had an opportunity to look through a telescope. They divided the kids into groups of boys and girls. Eleanor Maccoby and her colleagues were interested in studying how the children went about the taking turns looking through the telescope. There's a whole group of kids in the room. They have a limited amount of time. There's one telescope. How did they make their decisions about how they would use the telescope? What were the strategies? What were the interaction styles? And what she discovered was that there tended to be a little bit more mayhem, if you will, as a sweet term, not as an aggressive term, with the boys, where there wasn't necessarily deliberative planning, but the boys would like try to see through the telescope, and another little boy would come up and knock the kid out of the way and take his turn, and then another kid would wrestle him out of the way, and they were laughing and joking and having a good time, but they were each trying to get their turn looking through the telescope. Whereas in the groups of girls, you didn't see as much of that, sort of jockeying for control. What you saw in the groups of girls was more thought process given at the beginning about, well, you go first, you can take a minute, and then after it'll be her turn, and I'll go after that. So there's more planning. It's not that there was never planning for the boys. It's not that there was never competitiveness among the girls, but the styles the kids used was quite different. If you were Eleanor Maccabee's research assistant and you were there in the corner with your clipboard and you were taking note of what you saw, that's what you would have seen with a lot of the different replications of the interactions that were recorded in the study that she did. So again, sort of mean differences across groups, average differences across groups in the communication styles that were being used. Around the same time as all this research was amassing, a key study on use of language was done by a woman named Amy Kriatsis, who was at UC Santa Cruz. She studied the communication interactions of best friend boys and best friend girls playing together in pairs with Playmobil. And so there's a couple different Playmobiles depicted on the screen. On the right side, there's a Playmobil of a hospital setting. On the left side, there's a Playmobil with a circus setting. And so half the best friend boys got to play with the circus, half the best friend boys got to play with the hospital, and the same for girls. Half the girls got circus, half got the hospital. And then what Kriatsis did was she just analyzed the verbal interactions of the boys and girls as they played together. And her analyses were really, really intriguing. What they suggested was that as you read transcripts of the best friend boys playing together, there was something that in the field of psychology they call parallel play. So one of the boys would say, he's going to put the cast on. And the other one would say, no, he doesn't have a broken hand. And the other one would say, yes, he does. Watch this. And the other one would say, he's going to go in a wheelchair. So the two kids were playing with each other. They had different narratives going on. They were each trying to enforce their own narrative. And they were playing side by side, and the play went on, and they didn't get into fist fights, or they didn't wrestle each other to the ground. They just kept playing, talking to each other, and acting their own play. The interaction of the girls looked a little bit different. So the interaction of the girls was like, well, this one will come skating up over here, and the others will be sitting in the bleachers watching, and they'll say, okay. And then this one will come down and play with the seal, and she'll say, all right. And then the mom will come over. And so the interactions looked a little bit different, whereas the boy was like, no, he's going to put the cast on. No, he's going to go in a wheelchair. No, this is the doctor. And they would sort of be jockeying back and forth for whose narrative would be dominant. In the girls' play, the strategies were different. The little girls tended to accept the other person's a part of the narrative and then add their own. So they weren't negating it, they were building upon it. So the narrative that they developed was co-constructed, but each girl nonetheless got a chance to put her ideas in. And so when they evaluated the narratives at the end, they found out that the little girls' narratives, which were much more complex and rich than the little boys' narratives. There was a theme, there was a story. It was developed together by the two girls as they played. It's not that the girls never disagreed with each other, but for the most part, there would be a building and bridging. So again, the sense of connectedness in the interactions of the girls as they talked with each other about the story they were building. Whereas for the boys, there tended to be parallel stories that sort of traveled alongside one another, but where there really wasn't that same level of bridging and co-development. Okay, so you might say to yourself, all right, so that meant that the girls probably had a much more fun time than the boys did. And it was very interesting, absolutely no differences. So in the final analysis, the little boys had every bit as much fun playing with their best buddies as the little girls did. The styles were different, the communication patterns were different, the nature of the engagement was different, but it worked for both kids. It worked for the best friend boys, and they had a fun time. It worked for the best friend girls. They had a fun time. And I should tell you, this was no different than some of the findings from Maccabee's observatory study. The kids, the boys, when they were playing together, they're knocking each other out of the way and they're each taking turns. But at the end, she had two measures of interest. The first measure was what was the average amount of time that the children got to look through the telescope? And guess what? Each of the boys got a turn. Each of the boys had a chance to look through the telescope. The strategies weren't all that well developed, but the strategies worked. And for the little girls, it was very, very much the same, that they had approximately equal amounts of time to look through the telescope. Their approach was really, really different, but they worked too. But then the key measure, again, how much fun did you have? No differences between the boys and girls. The sort of more sort of rough and tumble style of the boys led to them evaluating experiences as way, way fun. And the same for the girls. At the end, they had way, way fun. And the styles worked. The boy styles worked for them. The girl style worked for them. Just like in the Criazza study with the best friends, the boys had a great time playing with the Playmobiles with their buddies. The girls had a great time playing with their buddies. So I hope that some of this is beginning to take shape for you and make some sense. We have almost these different cultures that the boys and the girls are developing as children. But within each culture, the kids feel really familiar, really comfortable. Like this is a style they know well. They've practiced it many times, and it's the style they bring to their interactions with their friends. So all well and good when you walk into an elementary school classroom and you get the boys sitting at one end of the table and the girls sitting at the other end of the table, and a few kids in the middle, right? Boys sitting with girls. And that tends to be a situation in which the kids are neighbors and they know each other, or they're best friends from being really little, or maybe they have brothers and sisters. So it's not that none of the boys play with the girls, but for the most part, in most elementary schools in America, you can walk in and see this gender segregation during the elementary years. That's all well and good. Kids are learning the different cultures. They're acquiring the rules. They know the rules. And then what happens is as kids enter into adolescence, boys and girls come together in relationships for the first time. And now each of the in cisgender relationships and heterosexual relationships, we've got a boy and a girl, teenager, young person, they're bringing the different rules that they've learned in their different cultures to form an intimate relationship. And so this is where some challenges can occur. So when a boy comes into the relationship with friendship, meaning you show up, you're there with your friend. Being close by means I love you. You don't really need to talk a whole lot about your feelings, but you're, by virtue of your being there, you're sending the signal I love you to your best bro, to your best friend, and you're sending that same signal to the girl you're with, and the girl you're with, sending to you as your boyfriend, expects that she'll be able to share with you in the same way she shares with her best girlfriends. And you'll want to sit and talk, and you'll want to share feelings, and you'll want to communicate with each other. And that's what best friends do. And so each of you is bringing expectations about what a close, intimate relationship will look like and feel like based on what you know from the relationship that you're most familiar with. But it doesn't quite get interpreted in the way you intended. So for the girl who is anticipating and looking for a lot of talk and not getting it for her boyfriend, she's wondering, why aren't we talking? We love each other. We're supposed to be intimates. People that love each other and care about each other talk about things. And for the boy who's misunderstanding why it is that he's there all the time, he's not hanging out with his buds, he's with his girlfriend, they're doing things together, they're enjoying each other's company, but there's some stress in a relationship. Why is that? I'm here, I'm choosing you, I'm with you. And it doesn't quite register that the lack of intimate communication is what the challenge might be between the two of you. So people are sending love messages to each other, but they're not necessarily being received and interpreted by their partner, largely because they were not a big part of the communication system that each of them came to know and know well from the same-sex relationships they shared with their friends when they were growing up. And so there can be challenges, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of these challenges. This is what often brings couples into couples therapy, is that there's a sense of a disconnect, that each of the partners is not getting from the other person really what they're looking for, and what in their experience means love, means closeness, means connection, means intimacy. And it is puzzling to the other person because the other person is doing everything in their power that they know how to do to communicate their love to the other person. So Deborah Tannen was one of the first psychologists to study this systematically in the research. She talked about gender differences in the use of language. So some of the gender differences that she noted in her observations of couples, partners who are interacting with each other, were some things that had been learned during interactions with same-sex friends during the years of growing up. And so you can see just some of them that she talked about in her book, You Just Don't Understand, are listed here. So for boys, when they're playing together, the use of intimate eye contact is not as common. It's not that boys never look each other in the eye, but that's not a big part of communications, where that's a common part of communications for girls. In terms of the use of language, we talked about the best friend boys playing together with Playmobil, and they were using talk to dominate one another and to have one another's narratives become the dominant narrative. Whereas for girls, the talk was helping to bridge ideas and thoughts and to feel connected and to have solidarity. And you can see that I won't go through each of these one by one, but you can see the ritual opposition is an interesting one. Sort of fighting with your friends is fun. I mean, that's like what it's all about. Whereas for girls, fighting with one of your best friend girlfriends is not fun. There might be a fight, but it's less than fun, and you need to talk in order to be able to get back into a good place. If boys happen to have an argument with one another, the way that they resolve it is not to talk it through. They just show up the next day and they're back, and here I am. And so the I love you is here I am. I'm back, no hard feelings. Let's pick it up again today. So, the pact that boys have with others is that they're not going to talk about it, but they just kind of pick right back up again. And just by virtue of their being there and not leaving, they're communicating with the partner, still love you, bro. And let's get right back to it. So whereas for a girl, that kind of a rupture in a relationship, really, there does need to be some repair. There does need some talk to pick things back up and get things back on a good, platform again. So again, these are group differences. Any of these things may not fit perfectly for you as a boy, as a man, as a girl, as a woman. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that these are differences picked up time and again in research studies that are gender differences in how males and females communicate. And so again, when you're bringing these different styles into intimate relationships, you can run into some challenges there. This, for me, as a couples therapist training, was one of the most memorable studies I learned about. And it kind of hopefully will make sense to you based on everything we've talked about so far. This was a study that was done by John Gottman and Robert Levinson. Bob Levinson, longtime UC Berkeley psychology faculty member, who studied couple relationships. And they were doing their research in the 80s and 90s when so much of the new technology that we now take for granted was just being introduced. And so video cameras and video footage of couple interactions, brand new. Time codes to sort of mark the interactions in real time, so you could loop back to it and say, what was the couple doing at 11 minutes and 30 seconds was brand new. So you could go back and review a video and have your research assistants go back and look at that same footage and decide what you thought was going on there. And most elegantly, some of the equipment that you could use in psychology laboratories to measure galvanic skin response, to measure physiological arousal, the use of electrodes, the use of sort of blood pressure cuffs, the use of different techniques to be able to monitor arousal, heart rate in real time as couples were in the lab talking with one another about conflicts they were experiencing. So this was the genius of the Gottman-Levinson paradigm. They would have primarily married couples was their research. The research over the last 30 years has involved gay and straight couples, couples that are not in a relationship, divorced couple, all kind. You imagine the research has just proliferated and gone all over the place. But back then, it was mainly married couples that Gottman and Levinson were studying. They'd been together for a while. They brought them into the lab. They had them discuss a couple of conflict issues. One, which was an issue for the husband, but not the wife. The other one was an issue for the wife, but not the husband, and talk together for 5 minutes about their conflict to see if they could make any progress. And that was it. Those were the instructions. And then they were asked to have the conversation. The researchers would leave the room and they would have the conversation on video with their heart rate and breathing and so forth being monitored by the machines that were measuring in real time what was happening with them physiologically. So we had the videos on screen, as they're talking to each other with the time codes, and in sync with that, we had the physiological reactions that they were experiencing. So very, very interesting. What they were able to document was very different patterns of arousal by men and women during these interactions. So if you can imagine looking at a chart and watching the needle move in terms of heart rate and respiration and arousal. What happened very quickly is that when the conflict conversation began, you would see the woman's arousal begin almost immediately to increase. And it increased for the first minute or two, and then it kind of plateaued. And it stayed at that level, that higher level than baseline for the duration of the conversation. And then the conversation ended. And then over the next minute or two, you would see her arousal. And again, we're not talking about sexual arousal. We're talking about physiological arousal, heart rate, respiration, sweating, galvanic skin response to those things. Her arousal would return back down to baseline again. So pretty clear among the women in the study, the average response was that women's arousal would jump up relatively quickly. It was a gradual, it didn't jump, it was a gradual increase, but it would, over the first couple of minutes, reach a new higher level, and then the heart would be beating and the breathing would be a little bit quicker, the eyes would be more dilated, all of the measures of arousal you guys are so familiar with. And it would stay that way until the interaction was over. And then as they left the monitors on, the woman, her arousal would come back down again. So a few minutes after the interaction was over, she was back at baseline again. Okay, can you all picture that in your minds, what that looks like? So here's what's going on with her partner. Same interaction, same time code, same words being said between them. The needle didn't move for the guy, right? So the conflict conversation begins, and he's keeping his baseline level of arousal. He's not showing the increase that his wife is showing. So it's staying low, and it's staying low, and it's staying low. And then at some point, what you see is a dramatic shot up in his arousal. So it goes from a baseline level where it just shoots up, and it extends beyond the arousal that his wife is experiencing. Remember, she's at a heightened level of arousal. So now he's exceeded her. His heart is beating fast. His arousal has gone through the roof. And that arousal, once it's shot up, it stays there and stays there for the rest of the interaction. And now the interaction's over, and his wife's arousal level is coming back down again. But you know what? The guy's is not. His arousal level is staying high. The interaction's over. It's 2 minutes later. It's 3 minutes later. It's 5 minutes later. It's 10 minutes later. And his arousal is still high. He does not return to baseline. He's now in this very noxious state of being flooded, overwhelmed with arousal. And it takes a while for his arousal to return to normal. So the two patterns look really, really different. But here's a couple things that are really, for me, were gripping. The first thing that was gripping is if you watch the guy's face at that moment when his arousal peaks and goes through the roof, his face doesn't move a muscle. You can't tell as an outsider watching him that he's had this overwhelming shift in his arousal where he's now become flooded and overwhelmed. He doesn't show it to you. So of course his wife doesn't know this either. So she's carrying on, continuing to talk, sharing her perspective on the conflict, and he's now become flooded, overwhelmed. He's not able to hear her anymore. He's not able to participate. He's closing down. He's just saying, yes, no, but he's not any more longer in a dialogue with her. So the conflict resolution at that point is like impossible because he's no longer in it. She's still talking. He's just placating her, appeasing her, trying to get through the interaction, but they're not having any real conversation from that point on. They were in the beginning. When he was talking in those first minutes before his arousal went up, he was trying to solve the problem. He was trying to say, well, we could do this, or why don't we try this? Or I didn't know that. And he's in there problem solving during those early moments. And she's saying, no, that's not what I want. I just want you to understand. I just want you to listen. And so he's being frustrated as he's trying to solve the problem. And his attempts at resolution are failing. And all of a sudden he becomes overwhelmed and flooded. And so once a man or a woman has become flooded, at that point, they're just trying to protect themselves. They're no longer able to engage in productive, constructive dialogue. But as I said to you, his partner doesn't know that this has happened for him, and he's not letting it on. What has changed is the quality of the interaction. And so we can trace the exact moment when that arousal increases through this time code at the bottom of the screen, but nobody knows it except him. And he may not even know it either. He just knows he's no longer capable of having a conversation with her about their conflict. He's just shutting down, over aroused, and just kind of giving yes, no answers and trying to make it until the researcher comes back in the room and says, okay, 5 minutes are up. So that's interesting, right? That we have these different patterns of arousal during conflict, and that the arousal of the male partner, once it's been escalated, continues on well after the interaction has ended. So the second thing I wanted to share to you is that the way people have interpreted this over time is that what's happening in that early part of the conversation when the guy is in there trying to problem solve and try to figure out what the right fix is, and to get to the point where they're closing down the conflict rather than amplifying it. He's using the toolkit that he has where he's trying to sort of resolve conflict because he's not as accustomed to talking about conflict, sharing emotions, doing a deep dive on those things, as is his partner, who did a lot of this conflict talk with her best friend girl buddies growing up, and is much more capable of having that kind of a conversation without again becoming flooded or overwhelmed herself. It's a skill that she has. It's a capacity that she has. His skill, her capacity is being able to get in there and figure out what's the solution. How do we solve this? But that's not what she's looking for. So again, they're coming into the interaction with different sets of skills, with different expectations about what the interaction is going to involve. And as it happens, their bodies are not in sync either. And so the physiological arousal is in some ways their nemesis, as well as they're trying to solve conflict challenges that exist between them. And so this is really fascinating. This is something that men couldn't tell you about themselves and that women didn't know about their male partners. And but it is something that absolutely interferes with the ability to have conflict conversations. And so these are some things you want couples to come to understand and learn about a little bit. And in a little while, I'll tell you one of the ways that couples therapists might help couples with this. But this is part of the theme, right? So we talked to you, or I talked to you just a little while ago about how in the culture of best friend girls growing up, talk is a regular thing, intimacy, connectedness, use of language. It's not unfamiliar at all to girls. And for boys, the use of language to mediate and broker conflicts is not as commonplace. Boys tend to resolve their conflicts by wrestling around and I'm king of the hill. Or if they have a conflict that really is a bad one and it's negative, they show back up the next day. They show their buddy that they still love them. They still care about them. They don't use the word love. They don't talk it through. They just show back up and then they pick right back up where they left off. But if you have now men and women who are trying to use these same skills with another, just not working. And for women, go back to the previous slide I showed you, right, where we had the two buddies who were playing pool, the two girls that were having an intimate conversation with one another. And what might happen is that if there has been a relationship that's gone on between a young man, a young woman for a while, and the young woman is feeling like they're not having enough conversation. She has a lot of things she wants to share with her boyfriend, and she's not able to talk about those, and she's feeling kind of isolated because of that. She may approach her boyfriend with just the way that she might approach her girlfriend. It's just like the need to be able to have some conversation. And so, she may approach her and say, we need to talk. And I can tell you that the way that that's interpreted from the male perspective, for men who don't have the same degree of comfort and familiarity with one of their best friend buddies coming over and saying to them, we need to talk, because that's not the way things, we need to talk, is a flag that something's wrong in the relationship. And oh no, there's something that we need to deal with and fix. What's wrong? How can we fix it? And so for the girl, the woman approaching her friend, her boyfriend, all she's trying to say is, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's talk. I'm feeling lonely. We haven't had a chance to chat for a while. She's not coming as something that necessarily needs to be fixed. She's coming with a need for intimacy and connection. So she's coming with one approach. He's interpreting it in a different way, and they're already kind of misfiring right at the very beginning. So the we need to talk is a olive branch, an outreach, a way of connecting for the young woman, for the young man. That we need to talk is a signal that there's something wrong in our relationship, and we need to figure out what that is and fix it. And I'm here, I'm down. Let's get to the root of it. Let's fix the problem. And, again, from her perspective, there's not necessarily a problem to fix. It's really just an opportunity to be intimate, connect, and talk to each other. So people get into trouble that way. It's really a dance that many couples do with each other. And what will frequently happen if this becomes a well-worn pattern in a relationship is that you will see developing a style where one person is typically the person who approaches the other to have these kinds of conversations. So you don't have, in this case, we see a female partner approaching a male partner about wanting to have a conversation to talk. The male partner who is afraid that this is another conversation about what's wrong with us, what's wrong with our relationship. And his initial reaction is to draw and pull away. So she pursues and he distances. And this is something they do again and again, where the pursuit, the wish to have conversations, the bid to have conversations is disproportionately in the hands of one person. And in this case, and in a larger number of cases, the woman is the one who is doing the approaching and the man is the one who's doing the distancing. Now, it is absolutely the case that there are relationships where it tends to be more the guy who raises the issues and the woman who doesn't do so, and she is more the distancer, and the more she distances, the more he pursues. It can absolutely be flipped. You see pursuer distancer in gay relationships, lesbian relationships, as well as in straight relationships. So you can have a pursuer and a distancer in a gay male relationship and in a gay female relationship. So it's not. It's a couple dynamic. It's not a gender identity dynamic. It's not a sexual orientation dynamic. It's a pattern that exists in couples. But when you overlay some of the gender issues on top of it that we've been talking about so far today, then you do tend to see that when you've got 100 couples, male-female couples, it tends to be women who are more the pursuer, men who are more the distancer. Now, having told you that, and having told you it's a couple dynamic, there's a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that if you're working with a couple in therapy and you can break this cycle so that if you can work with the person who typically is the one who raises the issues, who brings up the conversations, who does the pursuing, and have that person not do that for a while, not pursue for a while, what you see is something quite remarkable. It goes on for a day, a couple of days, a week, and then what you find is that the distancer becomes the pursuer. The cycle's been broken. The person who's usually doing the distancing, because the other partner is not doing the pursuing, comes back and says, "Hey, what's going on? You want to, how are things? You want to talk?" And so suddenly now it's changed, and so the person doesn't have to be playing the role of distancer anymore. The change has been a relationship that the pursuer is no longer pursuing. The distancer doesn't have to distance. The distancer now becomes the person who is raising the issues. You can absolutely assign members of the couple to do this, but it's a little bit more artificial than if you can just break the usual dance or pattern that they have with each other, because the reality is that both members of the relationship enjoy the opportunity to connect with each other. But if you are giving the burden of responsibility to one person to always be pursuing, that then sort of entrains the second person to be the one who is drawing away. So I'm saying a couple of different things to you. One thing I'm saying to you is this is influenced by gender identity, gender pattern, gender dynamics, gender learning, but also that it's not just an issue of male-female at all, because we see it in all kinds of couples, and we see it as a pattern that can be broken if the pursuer stops pursuing, and then the distancer has an opportunity to do their fair share and approach the other person and be carrying their share of raising conversations. I'm making this a little bit more simple than it is, but hopefully you understand the basic idea here. And maybe if you've been in relationships that you've been a pursuer or you've been a distancer, you can kind of say, "Oh yeah, I recognize that. I see that," because this is commonplace. This is not pathology. This is so commonplace in couples, and almost every couple that ever comes into couple therapy, you have a variant of this. So what I wanted to talk to you next about was what this looks like in gay and straight relationships. We've talked a lot so far about cisgender male-female relationships. One of the things that's quite interesting is as we look at the nature of gay, lesbian, and heterosexual relationships, one of the things is that on average, and again, this is on average, those who are in gay and lesbian relationships report feeling more of a sense of support and camaraderie in their relationship, and fewer thoughts of separating than their counterparts, same age, in opposite sex relationships. And so, interesting, if you're a gay man or a gay woman in class, and you've had some, knock them down battles with your partners, and you go, "Well, that wasn't true for," anything is true. You can have a heterosexual relationship where none of what I've been talking about today ever happens, and it's just golden. You can have a relationship with a same-sex partner where you've got a lot of the dynamics that we've been talking about. One person wants autonomy and the other person wants connectedness. One person is the pursuer, the other person is the distancer. But as you look across, again, between group differences, in general, there are greater levels of understanding and support voiced by those in same-sex relationships on average than those in opposite-sex relationships, with a lot of variability within both. All right, so that's one of the findings. Second thing I wanted to share with you, and remember, on all of the slides I share with you in all of the class periods, you can click any of the links to learn more. So here, if you click the link, Understanding Transgender Relationships, it will take you to a recent article that's been published on what we know so far. And the truth is that what we know so far is relatively little. To be able to study transgender relationships using the same technology, using the same longitudinal analyses that we have been carrying on since forever for straight couples or for gay and lesbian couples, brand new work. So we don't have enough research, a lot of anecdotal studies, a lot of small sample size studies, but we're going to try, in the years ahead to learn as much about transgender relationships with longitudinal research as we currently know about gay and straight relationships, couple relationships. But it's not that we know nothing, and what is known so far, you can read about in the review article that I've got a link to here. In terms of what to do, it doesn't matter who your partner is in terms of your gender identity or sexual orientation. These are some techniques that can be very effective. So I wanted to sort of close this particular lecture by sharing a couple of things that I think people find useful. And if you think about the idea that all of us have needs for connectedness. All of us have needs for autonomy and separateness and independence, right? Whether we're gay or straight, male or female, cisgender, transgender. What you would like to see would be opportunities in all relationships for each partner to have an opportunity to get more of what they need. What I can tell you, and I've seen this for decades, in general, and again, this is globally speaking, it is a bit more difficult to get men to come to couples therapy than it is to get women to come to couples therapy. Some of the reason for that, researchers think, is related to what we've been talking about in terms of the cultures that boys and girls grow up in. So if you've got girls who are growing up and are accustomed to using language a lot and talking with their friends and talking through conflicts with their friends, they are more comfortable with talk as a mode of communicating, and therapy, which is a talking situation, feels a little bit more natural to them than it does to males who may grow up not talking and sending signals that you really love the person, care about the person, and want to be with the person just by being there, through your physical presence, by showing up, by not leaving. And so going to therapy where suddenly your female partner is a good talker and the therapist, be they male or female, is a good talker, and you're not a good talker, you're going to get in therapy and you're going to lose. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but if you're, a customary way of growing up is that there's a winner or loser. You play King of the Hill, you battle, somebody's dominant, somebody's less dominant. Then yeah, you might expect that what happens in therapy is the strongest person wins. And in this case, it's not physical strength; it's strength as a talker. And already you're in a one down position because you're not as good a talker as your female partner, or you're not as good a talker as the therapist. And so chances are good that you're going to have to surrender. You're going to give up what little autonomy and independence you have left, and you're going to end up just having to sort of be living in a world of talking all the time and having no time for yourself. Now, I'm being a little bit ridiculous. Please understand that I'm overemphasizing things, but I'm trying to encapsulate in a few words what it might be that causes the fear that men have of going into therapy, that they're afraid of what's going to happen is that they're going to lose face and they're going to have to surrender their autonomy, when actually what they're trying to preserve and hold on to may be that opportunity for separateness, independence, autonomy. And so, what women are hoping to get out of therapy is more of the connectedness, the sharing, the partnership, the communing, right? That's what they're craving, and they're hoping that they'll get out of therapy. And therapy is certainly well situated to help with that. But when you go into therapy, the most important thing that any couples therapist can say to you and reassure you about is this therapy is not going to work unless both of you get more of what it is that you need. And let that sink in for a minute, unless both of you get more of what it is that you need. So it's not, this is going to be a therapy where we do things her way, or this is not going to be a therapy where we do things his way, or if it's two hims or two hers, it's not that one person's going to win, one person's going to lose, one person's going to be the dominant narrator, and the other person's going to have to knuckle under. Therapy will work if both partners are able to get more of what it is that they need right now. How beautiful is that? I mean, as a promise to the team, and then how do you go about doing that is the big question. So let's stay focused, if you will, on what we've been talking about, the need that all people have for connectedness, the need that all people have for independence. And you may have both partners who are like feeling like they need a little bit more of that. The little bit I can share with you about some of the gay couples that I've worked with over the years is that you do tend to see when gay men come into therapy, and by the way, gay men don't always like going to therapy with one another any more than straight men do. So there is a little bit of the gender stuff that's involved there, and often when gay men come into therapy, what you'll find is that there is a sense of isolation and loneliness, and finding that bridge back to each other and connecting is a big challenge for them. That's if they get to therapy at all. Sometimes their separateness and their aloneness and their independence gets in the way of them even reaching out for therapy. But when they come in, you'll often see a prototypical male pattern of not being able to connect. And when two women who are partners come into therapy, often you'll hear from them. Sometimes it's about separateness and inability to connect, but often it will be about boundaries and blurring and not knowing where one person ends and the other one begins, and sort of oversharing, over enmeshment, and needing to have a little bit more separateness and independence. So again, here I'm stereotyping, and I don't mean to, but I'm just sharing with you that it's very interesting that you'll see some of the gender patterns showing up, regardless of whether you're working with a gay or a straight couple. There will also be some issues of how women present in therapy, how men present in therapy, regardless of their sexual orientation. So this is just sharing information with you. This is not, intended as an absolute at all. And the two techniques I'm going to share with you work no matter who the people are in therapy, who you're seeing. As I said, two men, two women, man and woman, transgender individuals, it doesn't matter. These are techniques that can be helpful. So the first one is called reflective listening. And this is a interesting graphic I hear of an hourglass, because for the first 25 years of my career, we actually did use an hourglass, in this case, a 3-minute egg timer. So it's not an hourglass, but you would literally share an egg timer with a couple in therapy. And the instructions are like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with you all doing this once a week for the first week or two. You're going to pick a day, and on that day, and it should be a day when you have a little bit of time to spend with each other. You don't have anything else going on. You don't have work demands. You don't have to be up at 6 the next morning. You have a little time to sit down for half an hour, and it won't take you half an hour, but give yourselves half an hour. You're just going to spend the time learning how to listen a little bit better to one another. And here's how it's going to go. One of you will start, and you're in the position of speaker, and you start the egg timer, and you have 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, you just get a chance to share with your partner whatever it is that you've been wanting to talk about recently that you have not had a chance to share. And your partner, your job is to sit and to listen. And so this is 3 minutes of pouring your heart out, maybe, or talking a little bit about what's going on with you, or what you really need more of, or what you have been feeling, whatever it might be. For 3 minutes, you're sharing your most intimate thoughts and feelings, whatever it is that you feel comfortable sharing, that you've been really wanting to say and to tell your partner. And your partner's job is to listen. Okay, the sand is done. 3 minutes are up. What happens with your partner? Your partner has to say back to you what they just heard you say. That's it. Not editorialize, not embellish, not dispute. They have to be able to say back to you what they heard you say. When they're done saying back to you what they heard you say, they ask you, did I get it right? If you do not feel they got it right, if they left something out, if they overstated something, or if they misinterpreted something, go, some of it, yeah, but not all of it. You got parts of it wrong. And then it's okay, let's do it again. And now you don't have to use the sand glass again. You can, and it's probably not a bad idea the first couple times you do it, so that you stay within 3 minutes, but you basically explain yourself again. You could choose different words. When you get to the part they didn't understand, you could slow it down a little bit. You can correct them. You can say whatever you want, but your goal is to try to help them better understand how you're feeling. And the listener, you're plugged in. You're trying to hear her or hear him in a way you didn't the first time, and really figure out what you got wrong the first time and not get it wrong the second time. So then it's over, and you go again, and you say it back again. and the speaker doesn't acquiesce. It's like, oh man, he got it wrong again, but I'm tired. I'll just give up. No, you want to keep working with them until you can help them understand how you are feeling. And you stay at it as many turns until you really feel like they got it. They said to you something that they never heard you say before without disclosing any confidences. I can tell you that within the last year, I've used this with my 22-year-old son and his girlfriend. And they had a spat, and I'm going to try not to betray any confidence, but they had a spat where his girlfriend was misunderstanding some time that my son spent with another girl who was a classmate of his. They went out for coffee. It was a girl that he had been friends with earlier on. And essentially, his girlfriend became concerned that he was developing feelings for this girl and not telling her about it. From my son's perspective, what he needed her to understand was that they had both just graduated. This was the only friend he had who wasn't quite sure what they were going to do next month, next week, in their future. And he needed to talk with somebody else who's feeling the same way that he was feeling. If he had a buddy that he could talk to from his school about this, he probably would have chosen to do that. But he wanted to sit down and just share how he was feeling with somebody who was going through the same thing that he was at the same time. And he felt like he wasn't able to explain this. And so when I sat down with her hourglass and he was able to explain that, and she's able to say it back to him, not argue with him, not challenge him, not bring up the past, just say back to him what he felt, that was good for them. He felt understood by her. She felt like she got some perspective, and that really helped them to push past an obstacle that they had. And they used this technique to do that. And then she was able to help him reflect back to her about how it was that she was feeling, so that he was able to understand her sentiments. And they didn't have to resolve it. There wasn't a winner or a loser. It was that they both understood each better. And that reflective listening is things that my wife and I have done. We've used it. I helped my sister to use this. Best friends have used it, and I've used it in therapy practice for a long time. You gotta play by the rules. You can't twist the rules to yourself. It's not point counterpoint. Now, when it's your turn, you what is it? Rebut? Not that's not a word. Rebut. You rebut everything that the other person said. But you might want, as the example that I just gave, that, my son and his girlfriend, they each had different perspectives on what was going on, and they just wanted the other person to understand where they were coming from. And so they did talk about the same thing, but it wasn't like I'm right and you're wrong, or you don't understand me. It was just really trying to help one another understand and get the sentiments the other person's feeling. So this is a very, very effective technique. You start out with once a week for half an hour, each of you 3 minutes, you're done. And then you can do it twice a week, and then you can do it for 5 minutes. And over time, you're doing it spontaneously, not just at the appointed time, but you're finding yourself using the reflective listening technique in moments when otherwise you might have gotten into a fight with each other, but you're able to bring it into that situation. And here's where it's really nice. So for a partner, be it a woman or a man, who felt like they weren't connecting and communing enough with their partner and having their feelings heard, this is a real good chance to have their feelings heard. And if you happen to be the person in the relationship where your partner is not expressing themselves, not talking to you, feel like they're kind of isolated and alone, and maybe your partner does have some feelings that they want to share, this kind of helps them to tell you how they've been feeling. So a lot of the mystery goes away. Your partner can take 3 minutes and let you know about what's going on with them. And it's good for them to be able to articulate how they're feeling as well. And so both for the person who wants to talk and is feeling a need to do that, and for the person who talks less often and doesn't really get a chance to share how they're feeling, this technique works for both. It helps to support the connectedness. It helps to support the opportunity to share and feel intimate and close with one another. And it really helps with that. So that's the connectedness side of things. But what about the independence, autonomy? Where does that come in? So the caring days is the second technique. And again, the imagery that I've shared with you here, I've put on the screen. It's a guy working out alone independently at the gym all by himself. It's a boyfriend and girlfriend just taking a quiet, leisurely walk and just enjoying one another's company and being intimate. And the idea here is that, remember the promise, this doesn't work unless each of you get a little bit more about what it is that you're looking for. So the promise here is that on 3 days of the week, you choose which 3, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, one of you gets to make a request of the other person, and the other person has to grant you that request. And it can't be anything coercive and it can't be anything hurtful or harmful. It has to be just like a regular everyday request, but you're allowing your partner to have that need met, whatever that need might look like. So if it is somebody who wants to just stop on the way home and have a beer with their buddies for a little bit before they come home at the end of the day, that's okay. If you want to take a little bit of time and just go to the gym and have a workout by yourself before you come home at the end of the day, that's okay. Whatever it might be that you want to do, just so that little me time, that little personal time. If you, want to, stop on the way home and visit with your mom or your aunt or your best friend, you can do that for a little bit. And the other person goes, absolutely, that's fine. We'll do that. So on your 3 days, you get what it is you're looking for, or it might be something a little bit more intimate. So on my day, I'd like for us to go out to that place that we love and get an ice cream together, or I'd like us to take a walk down on the beach, or I'd like to have a back massage, or I'd like to whatever it might be. And on your days, you get your requests met. So on 3 days of the week, each of you is getting a little bit more of what it is that you want, that you need from the relationship. And you're giving on those other 3 days to your partner what they're asking you for. So you're basically meeting the wishes, the needs of your partner as they articulate them to you, and you're granting them. They're called caring days. Each person is getting a little bit more of what may have slipped through the cracks in the relationship. So you want a little bit more intimacy, you got your 3 days where you're going to do some intimacy and your partner's right there with you. Want a little bit more separateness, independence, you got your 3 days, you can get a little bit more of that, and your partner's right there with you and giving you that time for yourself. And, it doesn't have to be divided up in that way. All 6 days can be about more intimacy. All 6 days can be about more independence. You get to ask, your partner grants. And so you're giving to each other. And the other beautiful thing about this, just like with the reflective listening, I told you that people find themselves using the reflective listening more and more during the week, not at the appointed time. What you find out is that people start doing the caring days, and then they start doing nice things for each other on the 7th day. And they start doing nice things for each other when the other person hasn't asked them to do it. And it becomes more a part of your pattern, your lifestyle, your way of engaging with and taking care of your partner. And now you're building more good stuff back in there again. So more positives have entered into the relationship, and each person is feeling more fulfilled, getting more of their intimacy needs met, getting more of their autonomy needs met. And it feels like a good balance. So, these might work for you, they might not work for you, but these are things that I can tell you over the years in human sexuality classes. I see students who come back later in the summer or, the next year, somebody says, hey, we're still doing your caring days thing, or hey, that reflective listening thing, that really made a difference for us. So please, feel as though this is something that you can take and try. There's no harm. The worst thing that'll happen is they won't work for you, or your partner won't get it, or people will not do it exactly right. But they're the kinds of things that are free. You don't have to pay a couples therapist for, and you can see some immediate benefits if both of you are game to try to, give the relationship a positive jolt. So I hope that was helpful. That was the couple relationships lecture I wanted to do. Let me just get myself back into the Zoom here. Give me a second. I'm going to unshare for a second just so I can ask all of you if any of you had any questions or wanted to ask me anything about the content, and I'm going to move on to the next part of the lecture. And you don't have to ask questions if you don't have them, but if you did, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, Jesse, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you. Go ahead.
My question was like, I think a lot of couples they try to, fix their communication issues or like work on understanding each other better. But I think like a big obstacle when it comes to that is like the hurt that comes from it. It's like, oh, well, why didn't you just get it the first time? And then they get hurt about it. It's like, oh, well, are you not trying to understand me? And I think like that's like when a lot of arguments escalate. Like it's like it comes from like a disagreement and then it just like their feelings get hurt. And then like you were saying earlier, like once they reach the point of like defensiveness, like all communication pretty much shuts down because they're just trying to prove their point.
A beautiful example, and I love that. And one of the things I think that I could have made clear to you as I was introducing the idea of therapy is that There's never been a therapy in the history of the world that has worked if both partners don't want to make it work. So the motivation, the collaboration, the willingness has to be there. Like you can't be past the point of no return. Often you'll see couples show up in couple therapy at the last moment when the relationship's about to end and they're about to divorce or about to split up. And at that point, when people are like past the point of no return, there's not a couples therapist in the world that can help unless both partners really want to try to stay in it. If one does and the other doesn't, it can't happen. That's not exactly what you said. You were talking more about the hurt and the why didn't you, and a lot of the recrimination and so forth. And so the couple would have to take their pulse at that point, say, are we both still in this, or do we still want to keep this going? Do we want to give it a shot? And both of them need to genuinely feel like they're not past the point of no return. Because if one of them is, there aren't any couples therapy techniques or any couples therapists in the world who can work magic. What I tried to share with you here is maybe one way of interrupting that. I wish I could have bottled the words you said because you said it so beautifully, but it's sort of like you're trying to do it, but then you end up in an argument and it kind of did, you started out with the best intentions, but then it degenerates. That's the safety of having something like the reflective listening. Like if you really are able, if you have the commitment, you're really going to try to do this, you really do stick to the rules. And then when you're done and you walk away. So there doesn't have to be a debate that erupts, because if the debate erupts, you haven't stick to the rules, right? The goal was not, if I can go back to my son and his girlfriend, the goal was not for them to figure out why they got into this mess that they got into about fidelity and jealousy and lying and over, all of the, I mean, those are things, right? Those happen in relationships, but it was really for each of them to make sure that the other person understood how they felt. And they were never able to get to that point because then they started out with good intention and ended up degenerating into the, you always do this, why didn't you? And then it's a debate and the arousal's up, listening has stopped, and you're right that things do fall apart at that point. So it does have to be a pact that the two partners make, that we're going to try this reflective listening thing and we're going to follow the rules. And when we're done, we're done. I said what I said and you heard me. You said what you said, heard me. And then we're done. And then we go out and we get pie, and then that's it for that interaction. And we can try it again later. And I don't mean to oversimplify it. And I don't mean to make it sound like it's simple. It's not. But if you've got the commitment, this can be a way of breaking that cycle that you're talking about, where you start out with good intentions, but then you end up, degenerating a little bit because somebody says a key word, a trigger word, and then you end up, all the stuff comes flooding back again. And no longer are you like maintaining the same commitment at that point to try to hear each other out. Now it's, the pattern, you've fallen back into the pattern again. So this is not a magic bullet. This is not a panacea. This is something that may be better done by, using a couples therapist. But ideally, you'll have the couples, when my son said, I told him about this technique and he goes, I don't know if I want to talk about this. And I don't know if Rachel was like, it's okay. You got this tool set. You can bring it up. You cannot bring it up. You can talk to it when you're stressed. You can talk to it when you're not stressed. You can never talk about it at all. Just have this in your hip pocket. And, and they didn't use it for a while, but then eventually he did introduce it and he found that it was helpful for them in breaking through this impasse and this replaying that they had of the same argument over and over again. They found that by actually listening to each other and making the other person believe that they heard them, that's the key in this, right? It's not just like parroting back. It's having the other person say, yeah, you get it. That's what I was trying to explain to you. They're not going, you idiot, why didn't you hear me before? But just like, that's it. Yeah, I think you got it. That can be very validating to the speaker, and the other person, can think about what their partner was really saying to them and why it hurt them or why it mattered to them or why it was such a thing that they couldn't let go of. So, again, I'm not trying to paint you a beautiful picture of something that doesn't exist, Jesse, but I am saying this can be an effective tool, but you've got to have that dual commitment. You've got to be able to introduce it at such a time when both of the partners are game to try it out. And you got to kind of stick to the rules too. Maybe it'll help. Maybe it's not going to help unless you have a couples therapist helping you. So, Gabriel, your hand is up. Yeah, thank you. It was a great question. You asked exactly the right time. I did leave that out of my lecture, and I'm grateful for your question. Gabriel, go ahead.
Yeah, so on a similar kind of topic, how do you deal with like couples who have one of the partners as like a narcissist?
Yeah, well, there you go. So if somebody has psychopathology, then nothing's going to help. The question is really, is the person truly a narcissist, or is some of that anxiety? often you'll see that the person like it just is not capable of doing something differently, and the only thing that's really going to be helpful will be a reflective therapy to try to work on oneself. And I don't mean to poo-poo the point. We do in couples therapy, I think there's a lot of times when you'll have a divorce situation and they both say they want what's best for the kids, but one of the two partners clearly is trying and the other person just wants to do in the other person and will undermine things and will come out, and it's just clearly not playing by the rules. And then you start to realize it's so entrenched that it's just not going to work. The best thing you can do is get these people to their separate corners to try to protect the kids. You're never going to be able to build collaboration and cooperation, communication. That's a thing that does happen. It happens in love relationships too. And so if someone genuinely has a narcissistic personality disorder, you may not be able to help that in a couples therapy. I'm just being candid and honest with you. If on the other hand, they have narcissistic traits, which some of us do, and we all have healthy narcissism, and then some of it can become a little problematic if we're anxious and we're falling back on what we know best. Sometimes there can be work that can be done in a couples therapy, but sometimes the individual work has to come first. So I'm not trying to be again, I'm not trying to be glib, and I'm also not trying to be fatalistic here. But if someone truly has hard entrenched narcissistic traits, a lot of these things are very hard to do because you've got to have that collaborative spirit to try to work on it together. Haya, is that how you say it? I don't want to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's right.
Haya. Okay, good. So what's your question?
My question was in regards to what you've discussed with how girls and boys grow up.
Yeah.
It seems like boys tend to grow up being emotionally unavailable, if I'm understanding that correctly, because they don't communicate
So
properly.
again, so here again, I'm talking about normatively, and I was talking about the culture of boys and the culture of girls. I'm not talking about my poor son had to deal with more emotional stuff in his life than any, so it's not an individual person, right? And it's a question of, do you have all brothers or all sisters, right? I mean, that matters too for a little boy growing up. But by and large, as you look at and I think that you would find this true if you went and watched Best Friend Boys playing together in Berkeley, and then you watched Best Friend Boys playing together in Vietnam, and then you watch Best Friend Boys playing together in the Congo, and you watch Best Friend Boys playing together in Brazil, and you would see similar patterns about how boys interact. And so it's not that there's not. I don't want to be stereotypical again and say boys don't talk about meaningful things with each other. They absolutely do. They have meaningful conversations. They do it less. They do it less intensively. It's not an everyday thing, but they do it. But then when it comes to having the intense emotional conversations, if a girl has had them 150 times in her lives and a boy has had it 9 times in their lives, the girl is more practiced. So I think that's maybe a better way of thinking about it, rather than saying that boys are emotionally impoverished and unskilled and and incapable. It's just that I as a therapist, am able to explain things much better to somebody than my best friend, Doug, my buddy, who's an engineer. And Doug, if he's trying to explain to you engineering, he can do way better than I can because he talks about it all the time. He thinks about it. He's more skilled at it, and he can help you understand it better than I can. So think about it in those ways, not necessarily that there's a deficit or a lack or some kind of a problem with boys or a problem with girls. I'm kind of describing to you the typical experience that children have growing up. If a boy's lucky enough to have a couple of sisters and they have emotion conversations every night, awesome. He's got it. He's got everything he needs because he's having those conversations that maybe his buddies who have 2 brothers and no girlfriends, don't get to have. I want to make sure I'm answering your question, but is that fair? Okay.
Yes, that's good. I have
Thank
another
you.
question in
Yeah,
regards
good.
to the psychological differences in arousal during conflict.
Yeah.
What we talked about when the guy's face during arousal peeks through whatever, blah blah
Yeah.
blah. And so in couples therapy, do they discover each other's attachment styles? Because could a person be able to establish like from a secure attachment to becoming an avoidant
Yeah.
person
Yeah. So what I would say there is that different couple therapists have different styles, and certainly one could work with partners, one who is anxiously attached, one who's avoidantly attached, or one who's secure, one who's avoidant, without ever using those terms, right? You could help to kind of break through that without having them be mindful about their attachment patterns. Other therapists would be all about the attachment patterns and use that psychoeducationally to help the couple. So, but what I would say to you there is, at minimum, what you want to be doing is if you've got somebody who is being flooded with emotion, whether it's the man or the woman, right? So they're being flooded and their partner has absolutely no idea. That's you're trying to help the person become more mindful of this, be more aware and attuned to their own body and their own somatic things, and to be able to communicate to their partner, not right now, we got to stop. And so if I'm saying to you, you're my partner, I'm saying to you, I'm flooded, or I don't have the words. I'm just going, can we stop? Can we take a break? You can't say, no, we're not going to take a break. We're going to talk about this right now. I've told you, I've signaled in my halting way to you, I'm flooded. Can I take a break? And so in therapy, they would work with me to communicate to you. They'd work with you to hear me, and then we would take a break. But they would also work with me that when I'm re-regulated, it's my job to come back to you and say, hey, can we pick that conversation back up? It's not your job as the pursuer to chase me around and get it going again. I'm the one who asked for a break. Now I come back to you and we resume the conversation. That's the shared mutual agreement we have with each other. So you could be working on those kinds of things in the therapy behaviorally without necessarily doing the backdrop of avoidant attachments, secure, insecure, and so forth. But certainly couples therapists do the work in that way. And so there's as many different couples therapists as there are birds in the world, and but from my perspective, you can work on behaviors without necessarily having to do the deeper dive on mindfulness. Okay.
Got it. Thank you so
We'll
much.
take one more. Jesse, go ahead. You had a question, and then we'll move on because we've got a lot more stuff that we want to do today. So go ahead, please.
I kind of just had like a follow up. I think like what we said earlier just kind of like made me think that it seems to me that people who kind of grow up in a similar kind of like communication style tend to communicate better in the long term. And then it made me think because like me and my boyfriend is like the middle child. He's like always kind of like a people pleaser, always trying to like make everyone agree
Yeah.
with it. I'm the oldest, so I am a problem solver. I'm always trying to fix
Yeah.
other people's issues.
Mhm.
And that's the I and like that's one I think that's a big reason that we communicate really well is because at the end of the day we're on the same page in a lot of things. And it just like it back to the point where I made from my first question about people just like being too hurt to move past their like disagreements. It it reminded me of an incident where me and my boyfriend were arguing so much and then we were like yelling and then when we finally saw each other in person all I did was like give him a hug and all of a sudden like all of the arguments just went away. It was kind of like our way of like taking a time out and being like okay this is like let's take a pause and then like kind of like heal from the hurt in order to move forward. And so yeah it was just more of like a follow-up comment that I kind of realized after you spoke.
Yeah, no, I was almost characterizing stuff today. It character almost like painting black and white pictures when the world is gray, and so there's all kinds of things that can go to it. The reality is, I think people if you love and care about your person, you're going to be fine no matter what. And relationships are hard. Conflict is part of every relationship that's ever existed. And really the question is, what are the skills that you bring in? What's the motivation? Do you reach out and get support if you don't know how to figure some stuff out? How soon in the relationship you do that versus how long do you let it go on for and fester? How easily do you quit and give up versus how resilient are you? All of these things come into play. We got 100 relationships in the world and maybe 8 or 10% of those are these wonderful relationships where people click. And then you've got another, 10 to 20% where people were it was like oil and water and they shouldn't have been together. And then there's the rest of us in the middle and we muddle through and we struggle and we do the best we can. And really the commitment is such an important part of that. But it is really beautiful when you have people who are able to sort of match each other. There's a lot of stuff that we won't talk about in this class, just in terms of like what attracts couples to each other. And, sometimes you're like looking to either find somebody like you or not like you or meet a need or fill, and so that's a really interesting literature too. But I was just trying to share with you a little bit about generically, what do we know about couple relationships? What does that have to do with gender? And what are some ways that we can kind of not pathologize our partner? not say, oh, you're just immature, oh, you're just needy, and the kinds of mean things we say to each other, and just recognize, well, what is it that you need? How can I, how can I hear you? How can I support you? And so, and for many people, that takes some skill building, and it takes a while to get there. But if the commitment's there, and if you do it early enough in the relationship before all of that hurt builds and mounts, everybody's got a shot. And some relationships aren't meant to be, and some don't work, and that's a reality too. So this isn't like sort of a magic bullet, like I said, but hopefully some of this is helpful. All right, we'll do one more, Evelyn. I'll take yours, and then I really want to move us on, because this, we can talk all class about this, is really cool stuff,
Yeah.
but we got other stuff we got to do. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of like you said earlier, oftentimes it is harder for men to go to therapy than for women, because women are already used to like having a conversational style and not feeling afraid of using language to solve things, versus men, they are more discouraged by it, and the way how they grow up in culture. And like there came to my mind that men are like discouraged to show their feelings, that it's actually a sign of weakness to talk about your feelings, to have feelings in the first place. And that because a man's strength is his physical abilities and not his emotional abilities. Um, and then, so like what I was also then thinking about is, in what terms does this transfer also on the conversation, like within the couple, like at home in the everyday space, not just in therapy, where like are men so or males, if you want to say it this way, are they so indoctrinated themselves in that thinking that they shouldn't be talking about their feelings, that women often seek more conversation from them, and then t even tell them, hey, I want you to talk about this more with me. Why don't you talk about it with me? And the men kind of like start shutting down. Um, and that's where like the major issue starts, that they're not even aware of that they're shutting down, because that's what they've been taught and seen their whole lives.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully said, and I think that I didn't really get into some of the. We're going to talk about this, by the way. That's kind of we're kind of like presaging the topic we're going to go into in terms of the video we'll watch a little bit later in class, called "The Mask That You Live In," right? So the notion is that this is a pose, a stance that I used to show a film called Tough Guys, with guys spelled Guise, right? So the notion is that this is what men are taught to do in the world, but it doesn't mean that there's not a there underneath that. It's not as well developed. It can be cultivated, but it's not just as easily as saying, okay, open up, let's talk now. There might need to be some work that goes there, but it's that desire. I said to you, boys are not just independent. Girls are not just connected. We all have these as human needs, but one gets cultivated more in one group, and the other one gets cultivated more in the other group. So I absolutely think that man or a woman, if you're not acclimated and accustomed to doing this, there are ways that when you're with an intimate partner, that you can discover another part of yourself. And I think that potential is limitless. One of the things we won't talk about in this class, but that I'm a family therapist, and often when a couple has a child, you will find that there's a saying, the child is father to the man. And what will often happen is that you will suddenly see this emotional opening up and outpouring from the father that you had not seen before, as he relives life through his child and wants to give his child the opportunities that he didn't have. And so it's a beautiful thing. I think all of us are limitless, but I think you nailed it in terms of showing emotion as a sign of weakness. It's certainly a sign of weakness with your buddies, right? But it's not a sign of weakness with your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whoever it might be. But that's something you have to learn. And so part of it is that learning process. And I think the other thing also is sort of, I was trying to sort of not say that this is a flaw that men have. I think the misattribution that a lot of women have is that the men are not sending love signals. And for the men, but this sounds ridiculous when you say to some women, but it's God's truth. By virtue of the guy being there with you, he is often deliberately not spending time with his mates, with his buddies, with his friends. He's putting them away to be there with you. I love you. I'm here with you. I'm not with them. I'm with you. And you're just like, well, you better be with me if you want to keep me as a girlfriend. Well, that's not the right response. It's like trying to understand how heroic this is, and from a girl's perspective, that makes no sense because I'm
Yeah.
with my girl, you know what I mean? So I think it's really just trying to understand the perspective of both partners so that both are valued, both are given voice, both are honored, and then you try to figure out how to do all this complicated stuff that every couple that's ever existed has to figure out how to do. So, but I
Yeah,
love that you brought that in the conversation.
it seems like there is like a misalignment on both sides, on both
Yes,
males and
yes,
females,
that
on expectations on how to show love
you're
and how
hearing me.
and like seeing the signs, like actually recognizing, oh, my husband, my boyfriend, my partner is showing me love right now by doing XYZ, like to even recognize that.
Yes,
But
yes.
that we focus on like what is our expectation, and we're thinking, oh, that person doesn't show me love.
No, well said, and I think that I love this conversation. I wish we could talk the rest of the class period. So I know you guys probably have lots of thoughts about this. This really resonates, I think, with people. Ideally, what I hoped was and I don't want to be sort of cisgender about this, right? But hopefully that you have had a chance to see a perspective that was not your perspective from the lecture today, kind of see things a little bit
Yes.
differently. Because if everybody in the class got a little bit of that, that's going to help you in the relationship you're in or the relationships that you'll be in. Because it is really complicated. It's not like one right, one wrong, one good, one bad, one talented, the other one unskilled. That's not what it is. It's just different. And so we're trying to find ways to bridge the difference. And
Yeah.
so thank you for your comments there. So here's what I think I'd like to do. I'm going to share my screen again here, but this time what I'm going to do is explain to you what I would have covered had I just gone through the class period in the way that I had drawn it out. And we're going to jump to our guest lecture. So give me a second here from current slide. All right, and I'm gonna just tell you we did have the film Kids that some of you watched last weekend, and these were some questions I queued up for us to discuss. But I'm going to just ask your permission to skip over this right now, but to get you thinking a little bit about what we learned from Kids, which was really how much young people don't have an opportunity to learn some of the stuff we're talking about in this class, and we'll talk about today. There is a wonderful project. The Film Kids was built around skate culture, and skate culture itself has taken on some of the challenges that were highlighted in that film. And so they've been all about consent in recent years. You can click this website. You can read more about some of the amazing work that's going on nationally within skate culture for young people. And trust me, that's one of a million youth cultures. There's lots of other cultures where progress needs to be made, but it's a positive story. And here's an article that you can read a bit about the film Kids and some of what has been learned in the 25 years after that film was made. So this is a relatively recent study, 2022. So these are things I'd love for you guys to do a deep dive on in your own time. Also, we're going to get into the topic of sexual coercion, and I do have a video from our guest speaker, Jackie, who was going to be with us live today, was not able to be here, but I have her lecture from last semester, so we'll have a chance to watch that together. I wanted to acknowledge as we get into the material today that this is a very difficult topic. Every semester when I teach human sexuality, I ask people on the last question, you might remember that day one quiz, will there be any sensitive topics? And inevitably, there are a number of people whose lives have been touched by sexual assault in any class. And so that's many of you, whether it was yourself or a friend or your sister or someone, a loved one in your life. And so, important to say that this is a difficult topic. If you need to just, break away for a while during class period and come back later, that's absolutely fine to do. Most of all, just want you to kind of be aware of, how you're feeling. And then if you need to step away for a little bit, you can do that. Just take care of yourself. A lot of materials covered in the textbook, and we'll have some conversation in a discussion group at the end of the class period, but without any triggers. I promise you the questions we have queued up are intended for really to be thinking about things in a preventive, positive, pro-social way. You all know that over the last decade or so, the Me Too movement has really elevated our national awareness of how frequently both men and women are struggling with this issue. A lot of young men are saying, geez, now as I look about this, as I think about this, was I, always, doing the right thing in relationships? Was I ever forcing myself? Was I ever, not doing all I could to make sure that I had the consent of my partner? a lot of women who were saying, yeah, when I was a younger person, I just felt like I needed to go along. I wasn't able to voice. I wasn't able to articulate. And so the communication part is really important here. But communication is not the thrust here. Here, we really are talking about a situation where it is primarily men who are the aggressors and primarily women who are the survivors. Certainly, there are male survivors as well. And in a very tiny, tiny percentage of cases, there may be female perpetrators. And so it's going to feel like a gendered conversation because it is when we look at the overall statistics. But please, in any relationship, there can be variance on that. But here we really do need to be thinking a little bit about why is this, not just in the United States, but in cultures around the world, where the overwhelming majority of sexual assault is men who are involved with the sexual assault, and where women are the survivors of sexual assault. And when we're talking about rape and sexual assault, here, we do need to look at the definitions. The Department of Justice has defined rape and sexual assault for any sexual contact without consent, and consent has to be affirmative cooperation. We'll hear a lot more about that later in the class period today. California defines rape and sexual assault as sex without consent, where force, fear, or threats are used, or if the person's not able to give consent by being a minor, by being intoxicated, and so forth. This is we could spend a lot of time looking at this, but the impact of a sexual assault, not just on the person who experiences it, but on all of the various things that happen around them, really need to be taken into consideration. It's not an isolated act. There's an aftermath. There are things that preceded it. There are, ongoing challenges that will follow a sexual assault. And we're going to talk about some of those today. But this is just like one drawing of the ripple effects that can happen after a sexual assault. A lot of myths about rape. The biggest one, of course, being that the survivor did not know the person in advance, and that is absolutely not true. The overwhelming majority of all rapes are committed by someone that the person knows. The picture on the top was a picture that was introduced to me a while ago. This world leader, Golda Meir, in a situation where there had been an increase in sexual assaults in her country, and people were calling for a curfew where women should be home to be safe by a certain hour, said, over my dead body, if there's going to be a curfew, men are going to need to be indoors by a certain thing. Why are we doing this to women? We're sort of blaming the victim almost in a way. And I want us having that as something we continue to think about today, that we often will look at what the person who had been assaulted could have done differently, when in fact the answer to the question, what could have gone differently, is that the person who assaulted the other could not have assaulted them, to put the square blame back on the person who commits the assault, rather than looking at what the person who was assaulted could have done differently. So I think these are some things that are really important to say, and we'll say them multiple times during the class period today, but just kind of in setting the stage, that I should also say to you, while this is a conversation where we absolutely have to talk about men and women, the overwhelming majority of rapes and sexual assaults are by men. The overwhelming majority of men do not rape and don't think of rape, and it's not something part of the male condition. So I think it's very easy for men to sort of feel a little bit more put upon in this lecture. But the reality is that we stopped rape culture by everybody, both men and women, being involved to make things safe for yourself, for your girlfriend, for your boyfriend, for your sister, for your mom, for all individuals who are out there, that we have a collective responsibility to take care of. So these are some stats, and again, I'm going to move through these quickly. You guys have access to the PowerPoint, but this is the whole thing. 81% of female victims, 71 male victims experienced their first completed or attempted rape before age 25. So this is predominantly something that younger people experience, but older individuals can experience as well. About 2.6% of men reported experience completed or attempted rape at some point in their lives. And the statistics for women vary anywhere from 25% to 33%. So a very large percentage of people. What rape is widely unreported, which is one of the problems in trying to get a good handle on. The Department of Justice, only 19% of rapes are actually reported annually. And for every 1,000 rapes in the United States, 995 perpetrators go unpunished. And so it's a very, very complex situation. Just finding a safe place to be if you are a survivor, and finding ways to sort of deal with the aftermath, that is really tricky. People don't report because sometimes they're not so sure it was rape. They worry about confidentiality. They feel shame or that they won't be taken seriously. And because over 70% knew the attacker, people are not comfortable stepping forward. So again, coming back to that chart we looked at before, the impact has these ripple effects, and what happens after the fact is very complex and doesn't end quickly. It can go on for a while. These are the statistics just in terms of who the individuals are who were known to the victim. So whereas about 1 in 5 committed by a stranger, the remainder an acquaintance, a current or former boyfriend or girlfriend, more than one person by a non-spousal relative. And again, most men don't rape, but those who do differ principally in their attitudes about what it means to be a man and how they view women. So it really is about how we're raising young boys and young men in thinking about their masculinity. This is going to be a big topic for us later in the class period today. But here you see some of the characteristics of men who do rape that differentiate them from men who do not rape. The sexist beliefs, I'm not going to show the video here, but if you wanted to click on the link here, you'll just get a chance to see. And you guys could probably tell me this is as easily as I could tell you, but the notion that the man's responsibility is to be domineering, a real man is the guy who's in control. The whole notion that no doesn't mean no, that any person who would really want to have sex will say no at first, but ultimately they can be persuaded to say yes because they really mean yes, but they're saying no. That is a fallacy that goes back decades, probably centuries. And the notion you've all been taught at some point along the way, no means no, and then as the person who is the pursuer, whether you're a boy or girl, no means okay, not tonight, not this time. I'm loud and clear, I hear you. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about consent in a few minutes as well. And then just a few more stats in terms of what we know about those who commit sexual assault. And let me say to you again, any person can commit sexual assault. So this is not just conservative individuals. This is not just individuals who have certain characteristics. It really is more about attitudes, views of women, and I think faulty beliefs about what it means to be male and masculine. So we're going to focus now on college campuses. The lecture that I have for you is from my colleague, Jackie Simmons Groves. I'm going to play that in its entirety here for you all. Jackie gave the presentation to class previously, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then with you I will share lecture. And I'm going to ask you guys if you would, as I cue this up, let me find, first of all, on my dashboard here, her lecture, and cue it up. Now, and I hope I can do this properly. You guys just be patient with me here while I look this up. I've got it queued up at the bottom, but I got to choose the right one so that. Yeah, okay. Okay, and just going to play a couple of seconds here. Please let me know if you can hear okay.
Can you give me a thumbs up, May, if you see that? All right, great.
Does the sound okay for you guys?
Great, thanks, Emily. All right.
Someone in the class, can you let me know if you can hear the sound okay?
Yes.
You can. All right. Thank you. So we'll play this video. The video is about an hour long. You can take a bathroom break if you need to, and then I'll give you a short break after the video, and then we'll talk together about it, and then we'll have the next part of the class. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here.
Well, thank you everyone for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. My name is Jackie Simmons Groves. I know your professor also mentioned that Danny would be joining us today, but it's just going to be me. which is unfortunate because Danny's great, but we'll make do. So I work at the University of South Florida as the violence prevention coordinator there. And what that basically entails is providing programming, typically around topics like sex positive consent, healthy relationships, bystander intervention. And that's for our campus of around 50,000 students. So it's a pretty big undertaking, but we really enjoy it. Prior to doing the work that I do at the University of South Florida, I worked in a community context at a nonprofit that was a local rape crisis center. So a lot of that work looked like working with K through 12 students, working with community and professional groups, and really focusing on prevention of sexual violence. So that was a really cool opportunity, especially to get to talk to people when they're so young, to kind of really start building those ideas out all the way from elementary school. And in doing that work, I also did quite a bit of crisis intervention with people who have experienced sexual violence. So both people who have experienced it and their support networks. So I just want to give you all a little bit of context about where I'm coming into this conversation from, because I know conversations about sexual violence can be really difficult. And I think it's useful to remember that we're all coming into these conversations from different places. So with that being said, I have a couple ideas about how to make this feel like kind of a safe space for all of us to feel comfortable talking about such a difficult topic that I'll share with you. But I just kind of want to start with a broad content warning, which is that, kind of as the title slide said, we're going to be talking about sexual violence today. And that's a difficult topic. I mean, it's a topic I talk about every day, and it's still a difficult topic. So I please just ask, do whatever you need to do during this conversation to take care of yourself. So if you need to get up and take a drink of water, if you need to mute me and step away for a minute, do whatever it is that you need to do that feels comfortable. I always like to remind people that Zoom isn't a confidential space, so just kind of keep that in mind. If you do want confidential support, I think I've found where you can get that at Berkeley, and I'm going to put that in the chat. But May, if you know any other resources that are specific to your space, please feel free to add those in the chat as well.
Yes, I do. I'll post it in the chat.
Great.
As well. Okay.
And just in terms of like how we'll kind of function today, I really see this as a conversation. I want it to be collaborative. So at any point when we're talking, please feel free to unmute yourself or to kind of put comments in the chat. I think this will go a lot better if we're all kind of in conversation with each other. So the kind of broad community agreements I've come up with to keep this space feeling safe is first just that, as I said earlier, to take care of yourself, to prioritize that self-care during this discussion. The next thing is kind of a modified Vegas rule, which is that what's said here stays here and what's learned here leaves here. And what that basically just means is if someone shares something that's an opinion or a thought, we want to keep that kind of in this space with the knowledge that this is being recorded, of course. But we want to take the ideas that we're learning today and hopefully share them broadly, because I think that that's really how we create that culture change around sexual violence. The last thing I always like to just keep in mind is to make space for different lived experiences and different perspectives. So as I said earlier, we're all coming to this topic from different places, right? We've all had different experiences with getting sex education. We've all had different experiences supporting survivors, perhaps. So we just want to make sure that when we are speaking, we're trying not to universalize our own experiences. So those are kind of my ideas about how to keep this a safe space for everyone. Does anyone have anything that they would like to add to these community agreements before we get started? And as I said before, feel free to either unmute or just throw things in the chat. If anything comes up while I continue to kind of talk through some of this stuff, feel free to put it in the chat and we can always revisit it. I'm happy to add as we go along. So to kind of get this conversation started, I think it's really helpful to have a shared understanding of what consent is. And to start that, I always like to just free associate. I think some really interesting things can come up when we think about connotation. So in the chat, or again, unmuting, what words or phrases come to mind for you or do you associate with that word consent? What are like just like first free associations that come up with consent? Permission, sexy, yes. So interesting. First, we have something that's kind of like a synonym, right? So permission can kind of be a synonym for consent. But then we have that kind of positive connotation about sexiness, right? Affirmative, right? Yes, absolutely. That yes, no binary, we're seeing agreement. Really good. Any other thoughts or kind of words that come up? Ongoing. I love this. These are some of these key phrases that we're going to be talking about in a minute. So you all are already really familiar with some of this stuff. Any other words or phrases that kind of come to mind when we think of consent? Unambiguous. Absolutely, right? So it's that clearness that we're looking for. I'm noticing something which is great, but a lot of these have really positive connotations. So I'm interested, do you think that these are the kind of broad associations with consent? If I asked you, what do you think our kind of society associates with consent? Would we have any other different words or phrases that come up? Legalistic, right? Revocable. This is where we're starting to get some of those negative connotations. So maybe some of the social messaging we get around consent, kind of in a broader context, is not always these positive connotations that we're hoping. I really like that someone brought up legalistic. I think that often that's the context that we hear about consent in, right? Like some kind of form that someone's filling out. We think of medical consent, right? But that's great. I think that it's useful to think about associations because we don't live in a vacuum, right? Consent happens and it's informed by all the different kind of influences that we have around us. So our understanding of consent is influenced by our friends, by the media, by our education, by our lived experiences. And I think that that's really important to understand as we're kind of talking about both sexual violence and consent. So a lot of this is going to be kind of right in line with some of the words. And in fact, some of these are exact words that we saw in the chat. But I'll talk a little bit about what consent means to me. And we can always add to these if other people have things that kind of come up for them. But first and foremost, when I think about consent, I think of a checking in process. I think of trying to build space for other people to express their wants, their needs, their boundaries, right? Because we want to make sure that what we're doing is working for everyone involved, not just for us when we're in sexual contexts. So thinking about consent as a collaborative thing. I think that this process is really important to start before people are having sex, right? So how we're responding to a person, setting those boundaries in other contexts and other non-sexual contexts is going to dictate how comfortable they are setting those boundaries during sex. And the person who wants to kind of push that sexual activity further is responsible for doing that checking in, right? So I kind of, again, want to put this to the chat. So what are some ways that someone could check in or phrases that someone could use to check in during sex? What could checking? Is this okay? Absolutely. I think a lot of checking in looks like question asking. Do you like this? How are you feeling, right? So kind of getting that general comfort level. Any other thoughts about how we can check in? How would you like this? Absolutely. Are you sure? So kind of doing that double check. And I think what we can kind of notice about all of these questions, at least to my ear, is they don't feel awkward. They feel like normal questions that we would ask people in normal interactions, right? I think a big misunderstanding of consent is that it has to be legalistic or it has to be awkward. But these are just kind of normal check-in questions that you would ask during any activity. The next piece, and this is one of those words that got brought up in our free association, is that consent has to be ongoing, right? It's not some box that we're checking at the beginning of an interaction. It's going to continue throughout the entire sexual activity. And so we're doing that by watching body language. We're looking for that active participation. So for example, if one person is leaning in for a kiss, the other person's leaning in and throwing their arms around you, right? That active back and forth. We're also doing this through those verbal check-ins. So we have some really great examples that we just saw in the chat of ways of doing that verbal check-in. But it could also be talking about what you like and what you don't like. So kind of doing that open communication piece throughout the entire time. And finally, the last really important part about consent is that we want it to be informed, right? So someone needs to know what they're agreeing to, and that includes what type of activity they're agreeing to, if things like protection are being used, what type of protection is being used. So making sure someone really understands what that yes means. And in thinking about that informed piece, it's important to remember that different words mean different things to different people, right? Like language is really always in flux. So for example, I'm sure if I polled the entire class about what the word hooking up meant to them, we get a bunch of very different answers, right? And they'd be somewhere in line with each other, but they'd have these very kind of small degrees of difference that can actually mean very important things in the context of consent. The same thing if you even think about the word sex, right? Sex means different things to different people. So making sure with that informed piece that we're being really clear about what we're doing and what we're asking, and that everyone has a shared understanding of what's going on. The last thing to kind of consider with that informed piece is that sex can never be informed if someone is incapacitated. And I'm going to touch on that more on the next slide. And by the way, if at any point I'm going too fast or if you have questions, just feel free to put those questions in the chat. And if I miss them, May, just let me know and I'll be happy to kind of track back and answer those questions. And I'll also leave time at the end for some questions. So since we've talked about what consent is, I want to touch on what it isn't. And I think the first thing to say is that it's not transferable, right? So a yes to a kiss is not a yes to sex. A yes to something on a Monday isn't a yes to something on a Tuesday. A yes to something with one person isn't a yes to something with someone else, right? It's a one-time thing for one context. It doesn't transfer. The next big thing to remember is that consent should not be coerced, right? It cannot be existing in a situation where coercion is happening. So what are some situations that you could think of where someone could be coerced into saying yes to something that they don't want to do? What are some situations that could kind of produce coercion? If you don't do this, you don't love me, right? So that guilt tripping, that kind of holding that emotional guilt tripping over someone, absolutely. A physical threat, right? I'll hit you if you don't have sex with me. Or someone doing that minimization, right? It's not that big of a deal. So if someone has reservations, kind of minimizing those reservations, those are all forms of coercion, absolutely. It'll make you feel better, absolutely. Won't stop bringing it up. So if somebody's doing that persistence where they're not listening to boundary setting and they keep pushing someone and trying to wear them down, that can absolutely be coercion. Any other ones we're thinking about? I always think about power dynamics when it comes to coercion. Is someone in a position of power where they're kind of using that over somebody else? Or is somebody enforcing gender stereotypes, right? Like someone saying, well, any guy would do this, or, you know, using those kind of very broad and untrue gender stereotypes as a way of kind of policing what somebody does and doesn't want to do. So any kind of guilt tripping, any kind of threats, those are all forms of coercion. And those are not that enthusiastic yes. We want people to be saying yes because they actually want to say yes and not because they're feeling forced into saying it. The next piece is that it cannot be incapacitated, right? And we touched on this when we were talking about informed consent. And incapacitation can occur from both drugs and alcohol, but I also like to mention that it can occur from medication use, right? Like certain medications can have a sedative effect, and I think that that doesn't get brought up in the conversation enough. So when someone is at that place of incapacitation, they're no longer in a place to fully think through and understand the decisions they're making, right? So I think we probably all know the answer to this. We all kind of can conjure up in our head what it looks like to be incapacitated, but just to share in the chat, what are some signs that somebody might be incapacitated? What would that look like? Confusion, right? Like they're not fully understand, they're sleeping or they're getting drowsy, absolutely. So if someone's not awake, they're not in a place to consent. They can't stand straight. So we see that stumbling, that kind of leaning against things. Any other examples? I think any kind of slurred speech, not able to communicate clearly, if someone's unable to dress and undress themselves, any of those things, not speaking, yes, articulately, any of those things can be signs of incapacitation. And sex with someone who's incapacitated is assault, right? That's not, you're not in a position to consent when you are incapacitated. The final piece of this is that consent is not ever going to be assumed from a lack of resistance or from silence, right? So that lack of a no does not equal a yes. I'm sure many of you have heard of the fight or flight response, those kind of stress hormone responses. Has anyone ever heard of a third response besides fight or flight to stress hormones? Freeze, right? So some of us maybe, I think this has become more common to know about, but it's okay if you don't too, because I still think that we predominantly hear about that fight or flight response. But the freeze response, or what is otherwise called a tonic immobility, is this response that happens when our brains are flooded with stress hormones in response to high stress or traumatic situations. And while some people have that fight or flight reflex, other people actually freeze up, they're unable to move. So we're not taking a lack of resistance or passivity as a yes, because that can actually be a freeze response. That can be someone's stress response to not be able to move. And going along with that, this idea of silence, right? Dead silence isn't the goal of most of our social interactions. And so it's probably not good for that to be the goal of our sexual interactions either. And this just makes sense if we think about how we kind of exist in other contexts, right? So like, if you were going to play basketball with someone, you wouldn't just like chuck the basketball at their head and start the game. You'd probably want to discuss some things first. You talk about, where are we going to play the game? We want to make sure we find a time that's good for everyone. We talk about what type of game we're actually going to play. Is it one-on-one? Or are we going to do some kind of pickup game with other people? If you noticed halfway through the game, somebody was like kind of doubling over and looked a little out of breath, you wouldn't just keep insisting that they play. You'd probably stop and check in and see if the game was still working for them. So these are all skills that we use, we're really super familiar with in so many other contexts. And I think for some reason, people feel like they don't transfer over to sex, but they're still the exact same skills that we use all the time. So they're super, super normal. So with that shared understanding of consent, and again, if there's any questions about that, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're going to kind of move into our discussion of sexual violence, which is kind of what's happening when there's that absence of consent, when there is any kind of sexual interaction occurring. You're also going to hear me use the term sexual assault throughout this discussion. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term, but the way I'm going to be using it, especially because definitions vary from state to state, is going to be using it kind of interchangeably with rape. So any kind of sex act that's done without consent. And you'll see a graphic kind of on the right showing that umbrella term of sexual violence. It can kind of hold all of these different acts of non-consensual sex. So different things all the way from sexual harassment to sexual assault are going to fall under that sexual violence umbrella. I want to situate this conversation in the college context, since that's the context we're in right now. And I want to start doing that by looking at a study. So this is from the Association of American Universities, and they did a really, really large study on campus sexual violence. It's actually the largest study of its kind. It had 33 schools, over 180,000 student respondents. So we got really, really good data from this study about what sexual violence looks like on campus. And this is from, I believe, 2019. So it's still pretty recent. And I actually believe UC Berkeley was one of the schools, one of the 33 schools that was part of that mix. And they actually did this study as a follow-up to a 2015 study. So it's a really interesting one to look at because they have comparison points about how sexual violence has both changed and not changed from that kind of 4-year gap. I've included 2 graphs here that are kind of broken down by gender and affiliation. And they look at non-consensual sexual contact that the respondents are reporting since they enrolled at that school. So one is going to look at non-consensual sexual contact that's going to involve force or the inability to consent. And when they're talking about inability to consent, they mean things like incapacitation. The other is going to look at those non-consensual situations that involve other things. So where there wasn't that active ongoing voluntary agreement that we were talking about, but not using those kind of force things. So you can kind of look at these 2 graphs and just get a sense of both undergraduate and graduate students and how they experience sexual violence across these universities and colleges. I specifically want to highlight, though, because I think it's interesting, how affected the undergraduate populations have been by these non-consensual sexual acts that have involved force or have involved the inability to consent, because these are really big numbers. And it's kind of hard to hold these numbers because of how big they are, right? So we see that 26% of undergraduate women, 23% of transgender, genderqueer, or non-binary undergraduates, and 7% of undergraduate men have experienced that non-consensual sex with force or inability to consent. So 2 of those are basically 1 in 4 numbers. Those are staggering numbers when we're thinking about students experiencing that type of sexual violence. And sometimes I find like statistics can feel really impersonal or again, really hard to hold. But when I think about that 1 in 4, when I just look out at a classroom and look at 1 in 4 students, I think that those are really staggering. And when we kind of look more broadly from this study beyond just sexual assault and we look out at sexual harassment, 41% of students reported experiencing at least one sexual harassment experience since they enrolled. So sexual violence, I think for a lot of students feels really widespread and kind of baked into the experience of being in college. But as we're going to kind of talk about, it doesn't have to be that way, right? We can create better communities where that's not happening. We can kind of combat this, and that's what we're going to be kind of focusing on today. But I think it's first important to know the context that we're living in currently, and kind of the scope of this issue. Whenever I talk about data, I always like to note drawbacks to a study. I think one really important drawback is that, you know, when you're looking at 33 universities, these 33 universities don't represent every school, right? For example, historically Black college and universities were not included in this sample. So that's an oversight. I think another note about any statistics around sexual violence is it's really, really hard to get great data about sexual violence because people don't always want to report their experiences of sexual violence. And I'm sure you all can understand why that is. Partially, it can be because people don't recognize that their experience as being non-consensual because they may not have the information about what that actually means for something to be consensual or non-consensual. It can also just be kind of a hesitancy to report that experience to somebody doing a study, to other kind of reporting channels. So whenever I look at numbers, I always just assume that they're actually larger than are captured by a study. Any questions about this study before I move on? So today, as we're thinking, you know, I think it's important to really focus on what can we do about these things. When we hear numbers like this, when we hear about sexual violence, it can feel really daunting. But this is something that can be changed. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a given. But I think in order to create a culture in which sexual violence is less prevalent, we first have to really understand sexual violence. We have to understand the contexts in which it happens. We have to understand what it actually looks like and what it doesn't look like. And I think, unfortunately, this is a topic where there's a lot of bad information, right? There's a lot of myths about how sexual violence occurs. And a lot of those are around who is a survivor of sexual violence. So they really narrowly define who can be a survivor. I think we all kind of know what the tropes are around that. A lot of kind of narratives that we have culturally focus on women as being survivors of sexual violence, but we know that people of every gender are affected by sexual violence, right? But we don't always see those stories represented. Other myths kind of focus on what the root causes are of sexual violence. And others, I think the bulk of sexual violence myths that we see focus on placing blame on the wrong party. So placing that blame on the survivor instead of on that person who's perpetrating that harm. So as we're kind of thinking about this today, one of our main focuses in prevention is kind of undoing some of that misinformation and really kind of centering the survivors in our discussion. So I want to specifically, since we're talking about acquaintance rape today, look at one kind of myth that I think we're doing better on as a society. I think we have better information about this, but we're still not 100% there yet. Just using kind of that feature where you can like raise a hand or give a thumbs up. How many of you grew up hearing about stranger danger? Got a couple of raised hands. Yep. Yeah, so a good amount of us, right? I think stranger danger, I'm hoping people are getting a little bit better about this. But as I said, I worked a lot in elementary school, and there's still this kind of stranger danger boogeyman that exists. I know when I was growing up, there was a lot of programming about not talking to strangers. And I'm sure that there are really beneficial reasons to talk about that. It's not, you know, there are good reasons to still talk about safety in all contexts. But the data just doesn't bear out this stranger danger thing. So despite it being this really prominent narrative that we have, we actually know that most assaults are perpetrated by someone known to the survivor. And I'm sure many of you already know that. I think that there's been a shift in this understanding. But if you haven't heard this one, that's also okay, because again, this is kind of information that we've gotten from a very young age. And I also think a lot of TV shows, a lot of movies we see kind of show that person jumping out of an alleyway, that person kind of in a dark corner rather than the person that we know. So when we look at child sexual assault, for example, about 93% of the time that child knows the person who's assaulting them. 59% of the time that's an acquaintance, so someone known to that child or their family. And 34% of the time that's actually family members. When we look at adults, so 18 and up, 8 out of 10 times that is someone known to the survivor. 39% of the time we have that acquaintance piece, and 33% of the time it's that current or former partner. And I think sometimes that partner piece gets left out of discussions of how sexual violence occurs, right? But we know if we're thinking about how this kind of coincides with intimate partner violence, there's a very, very big overlap. So whenever we talk about myths, I really like to center how these myths harm survivors. So for people who have kind of grown up hearing that sexual assault occurs in the context of just a stranger kind of jumping out of the bushes, it's not someone you know, it can be really hard for them to identify their own experiences if they've experienced sexual violence from someone they know. It's hard for them to identify that was sexual violence. So these myths kind of make it harder for people to not only identify their situation, but also then feel as though they can get support with that situation. So the more we can kind of undo some of this stuff, the easier we can make it for people to feel like they can identify what happened to them and also get those support that they deserve. So I think a lot of this, something I guess, well, I'll back up. Something I'm very interested in is thinking about like where myths come from in general. So why do we think that there's this persistent myth about strangers? Any idea about why this myth kind of continues to be perpetuated? Why do we get so much messaging about stranger danger rather than messaging about like people we know? People don't want to admit that it's more likely to be someone you know, right? Like there's something a little bit maybe disconcerting about that. Any other thoughts? Yeah, it could always be in the back of our minds. Yep. Absolutely. It's easier to have the bad person be a shadowy person that no one knows, right? Like that's like psychologically an easier thing to swallow. It's someone over there. And I think a lot of sexual violence myths come from kind of this wanting to other violence. It's something that happens to other people. It's something done by other people that I don't know. So kind of keeping violence at that arm's length instead of seeing that it happens within our social spheres. So that's true of myths that place blame on the survivor. I think a lot of those myths are done to kind of create this othering. Well, that happens to someone who dresses a different way, or that happens to someone who behaves a different way. When we know that that's not true, right? But it's somebody's kind of tactic to other that violence. And I think the same thing is true when we look at perpetration, right? We don't want to acknowledge that perpetration happens within our social spheres by people that we know. We want to feel as though, as someone said in the chat, it's a shadowy other person. So yeah, we need to believe that someone who assaults is evil, not someone we thought was good. So right, this kind of wanting for this good evil binary, it's a lot harder to look at somebody who in other contexts of your life you think, you know, good things about or that you have love for, could be doing harmful behavior. So I think we see that kind of wanting to have this very clear delineation between this good and evil. Absolutely. So there's a lot of reasons why people are psychologically motivated to kind of create that distancing. Someone saying in the chat, it reminds me of a documentary called Hunting Ground. Yeah, that's a great documentary. I think it's a really good thing to watch about this. And if you want to expand, Alex, at all in a comment, if you feel comfortable about what that's bringing up for you about that movie, we can always circle back to that. I think it can be really scary to feel like this is something that happens in our social spheres, that it's people we know. But to me, that also presents a really great opportunity because we actually have this opportunity to enact real change. We can make change in our social spheres. When we think about change at like a global level, that's daunting. We can't, it feels very hard to change something across the country or around the world, but we can make changes kind of in those units of people that we know. We have that influence there. And so if this is happening With acquaintances, that means it's happening within our acquaintance circles and we can do something about it. Does anyone have any idea why it just makes more logical sense that it's more likely to be acquaintances who are perpetrating violence than strangers? Like, even if we didn't have the data to bear that out, like, why more opportunity, Esther's saying, absolutely, right? Like, who are you around more? Are you around strangers more or people that you know, right? We're typically more often in situations with people that we know, so there's just higher opportunity. We're also just in private spaces more often with people we know, right? It's a more, we let our guard down more around people who we feel comfortable with, that we're acquainted with. So again, there's additional opportunity there. Another thing I think about, though, with acquaintances, kind of going back to our understanding of consent, is that there's more opportunity to use those coercion tactics, right? So people who are in our social spheres are kind of uniquely positioned to exert power and control, to use those social relationships as a way of coercing or threatening someone. So someone earlier, when they talked about coercion, mentioned, like, if you really loved me, you would do this. I think that that's something that a stranger, that wouldn't work with a stranger, right? That has to be said by someone that we know. And that really connects back to this idea that sexual violence is about power and control. That is at the root of sexual violence. So if somebody is using sexual violence as a tool, they're using it to exert control over another person or humiliate or oppress another person, or they're deprioritizing someone's right to make decisions about their own body. So we're going to be thinking today about those kind of power and control dynamics, but I think it's really important to center that, especially as we're talking about acquaintances, because as I said, they're uniquely positioned to exert that power and control. I have a quote here from a book that's really interesting, and I really recommend other people reading it. It's called Sexual Citizens. And it's a book based on this really landmark study that was done at Columbia University looking at sexual assault on campus. And what this quote says is, peer networks and formal student organizations provide sexual assault prevention opportunities, but the same social pressures regarding reputation and the same genuine intentions to care for one another also create sexual opportunities, sexual assault opportunities, and missed opportunities for interventions. Sometimes students interpret the bystander approach to mean that they should keep an eye out for predators, when in fact they'd be better served by looking at their friends. So this is something we were just touching on, this idea that, you know, it's hard to look in our own friend groups. But I think a lot of what happens in our friend groups is that we're also setting up situations for people to have sex, right? Like, how common is it to play the matchmaker, to play the wingman? That is a role that we play in our social groups very often. So when this quote is talking about setting up those sexual opportunities, the inverse is that means that we may also be inadvertently setting up sexual assault opportunities, because we're creating spaces where connections and sex could eventually happen. But I think what, again, is really cool about this is that the inverse is also going to be true. People really care about what their friends think, right? So we can use that social pressure to intervene, to be that positive change, to kind of shift those norms within our social spheres that allow things like violence to thrive. And we can kind of then replace those with norms that prioritize a culture of consent. Sorry. My slides are backwards, so I apologize for that. Some of you may have seen this pyramid of violence before. I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but I first want to situate it back in that study we were looking at. This is that same AAU study where we saw kind of 33 universities had data about how their students experience sexual violence on campus. I think it's really interesting that 26% of students reported these opportunities where they saw sexual comments that made someone uncomfortable. 15% saw events that they believed could lead to assault, and 13% kind of were bystanders to what they saw as abusive or controlling behavior, and 7% said they saw sexual harassment. So those are big numbers. Like one in four seeing those sexual comments that made someone uncomfortable. Those are a lot of opportunities that people have to disrupt violence, even at that everyday comment level, those kind of normalizing behaviors that we see. And if you look to the right of the screen, we have that pyramid of violence. This kind of shows the way that violence escalates. Does anyone have any thoughts about why it's shaped as a pyramid? Yeah, so I love that, to show how prevalent each form of violence is. So maybe the stuff at the bottom happens more often. Yeah. And also that kind of correlation of one leading to the other, right? They're kind of stacking on top of each other. Yes, all of these things, yes. I think we see the behaviors at the bottom are those kind of everyday, very frequently overseen behaviors. We see objectification, we hear problematic language. And hopefully we're not hearing or seeing this every day, but they are more commonplace perhaps than what's going on at the top of the pyramid where we see murder. It's also pointing to that kind of the way they lead to each other, right? The behaviors at the top of the pyramid, those kind of escalations of violence, are first built on a culture where behaviors like objectification, rigid gender norms, and harassment have become normalized. So the more we normalize things at the bottom of the pyramid, the more things at the top of the pyramid can thrive. And again, I like to think of the inverse. This can be really disturbing to think that, you know, behaviors like jokes can lead to sexual assault and murder. But the inverse is also true, that if we're pushing back against normalizing of violence in our social circles down at those lower levels, if we're resisting people being treated as objects, kind of some of this oppressive behavior at the bottom of a pyramid, we can also kind of impact the behaviors at the top of the pyramid, right? I also think it can feel easier and lower stakes to step in and intervene towards the bottom of the pyramid. So we both have more opportunity to do that, and it can feel less dangerous to do so. It can feel less dangerous to push back against a joke than to potentially intervene when you're seeing a sexual assault. We also just probably have more opportunity to do it. So when we're thinking about culture change, really making sure we're kind of interrogating those behaviors at the bottom of the pyramid, that when we're hearing rape supportive comments, when we're hearing jokes that are about somebody's identity, that we're really kind of pushing back against those behaviors down there, so that we are kind of signaling within our spheres of influence, within our social groups, that those kind of behaviors aren't acceptable. Again, I think that makes that difference, as if we're saying that's not acceptable, then we are also saying that those other forms of violence aren't acceptable. Any questions about that? Okay, so we're going to be talking about this tactic called bystander intervention. I'm just curious, again, using that kind of hand raise function, how many of you have heard of or gone to a training or interacted with the concept of bystander intervention at some point? Just going to kind of scroll through really quickly. Maybe a couple of us, but yeah, I think that this is a really prominent anti-violence tactic that we see, not just for sexual violence, but other forms of violence that has kind of become more popular, I would say, in the last 10 years. But also, if you've never heard of bystander intervention, that is totally fine, because we're going to talk about what it is today. Basically, what bystander intervention is a set of tools that community members can use to kind of step in and help move a situation further from violence. So they're basically de-escalation tactics that can be used to kind of bring that situation further from that violent outcome. Before I kind of get into bystander intervention any further, I always like to kind of preface it with that note that violence is always the fault of the person who is perpetrating violence, right? It is not the fault of other community members, but that doesn't mean that we're not capable of being part of the solution. So we're still capable of reducing those instances by stepping in ways that feel safe, because as community members, as we've been talking about, we have those kind of unique positions to influence change from people who may not otherwise listen to kind of an outsider. So there's three main tactics that can be used in bystander intervention techniques. And the first one is called direct intervention. And it's kind of basically what it sounds like, right? You're directly intervening either with the person who's causing the harm or with the person who's being harmed. This can take the form of like asking questions. So asking someone who's being harmed, are you okay? Do you need help? Do you want to get out of here? So kind of directly going up to them and asking questions that can potentially help remove them from that situation, or see if they even want to be removed from the situation. Because I think a lot of the time when people think about being a bystander, a big barrier for them is feeling like they're not sure if somebody actually wants help, or they feel like they're being nosy, or they're stepping in, or they should be minding their own business. So sometimes just even asking that question of, do you want help? Are you okay? Can help get us over that barrier of feeling like we don't want to get involved. That direct approach can also look like talking to the person who's doing the harm directly. And again, if this is within our kind of friend circles, that could be, if we know the person who's doing harm, we can kind of directly talk to them about it. It could look like labeling that behavior that's causing the harm and letting them know that that's not okay. So I heard you talking to that person like that, and I didn't like what I was overhearing. Directly labeling that behavior. For some people, though, I know that some people feel as though that's too confrontational for them, or maybe they are in a situation where it doesn't feel safe to do that direct approach. Another approach that they could take is the distract approach. And what this could look like is being creative, right? So making up a story. You could say someone's car is being towed. You could tell someone that someone's looking for them. You could make a scene in some way. You could, flicker the lights on and off if you're at a party. You can tell the person who's being harmed like that you need help and that can they come help you. So doing something that's going to kind of distract and kind of de-escalate in the moment and let that person leave that situation. Again, for some people who aren't comfortable with that direct approach, this can feel easier, this can feel lower stakes, this can feel a little bit less scary than like calling out a specific behavior or kind of directly stepping into a situation. And finally, the last approach is to delegate, right? Because we know that there's strength in numbers, so maybe we don't feel comfortable intervening by ourselves. So we grab a couple of friends and say like, hey, do you see what's going on there? Should we do something about it? That can feel a little bit less intimidating sometimes. And it can also feel like there's kind of more of that kind of strength in numbers, amplifying of voices, where if there's multiple people saying something isn't okay, there's some kind of safety in that. It can also be about finding a person who has more power in a situation, who is better positioned to do something about it. So for example, if you were at a party, a host might have more power to intervene in a situation than you do, right? Because they can actually kick someone out of that party. So trying to figure out, is there someone here who's better positioned? They have more information, they have more power. Going up to them, letting them know what you're seeing and kind of asking them for help. So those are the three main approaches that we think about when we're thinking about bystander intervention. Any questions about those before I move on?
I do.
And I want to recognize that when we're talking about these, that it can feel easier said than done. Like in the moment when you see something happening, it's really easy to second guess ourselves. It's really easy to not know how to actually approach someone. And that's why I think some of these approaches, though, can be really helpful. So for example, if we aren't really sure if we should do something, just asking that question of, are you okay? Or turning to a friend and asking them if they're seeing what you're seeing can just be a way of kind of getting us over that barrier of discomfort. So I want to talk about a scenario. I'm going to read a scenario to you all, and then we're gonna kind of break it down a little bit. So Ben, a junior, met Talia at orientation when she was an incoming freshman and he was her orientation leader. A month later, he runs into her on campus and invites her to a party at his house. She doesn't know many people on campus yet, so she comes alone. The party is crowded and loud, but she eventually finds him standing with his roommates behind a makeshift bar. Ben pours Talia a shot while he nurses a beer, telling her she needs to catch up. Talia doesn't know anyone else at the party, so she stands around with Ben and his friend for the next half hour as Ben continues to hand her fresh drinks. You arrive to the party and you grab a drink. You and Ben are in similar social circles, but you don't know each other well. As you're getting a drink, you notice Talia leaning up against the wall talking with Ben. She looks dazed and her eyes keep fluttering shut. You hear Ben ask Talia if she wants to go upstairs where it's quieter so they can talk. Talia stumbles as Ben leads her out of the room. So the first thing I want to ask is, are there any power dynamics that you notice here that could be potentially in the future coercive? Are there any kind of power dynamics that could lead to coercive situations? Or even just power dynamics that we would want to be cognizant of before like entering a sexual relationship with someone. So she's alone at the party, right? So there's that kind of imbalance of how comfortable somebody might be in a situation because she doesn't have social support and he is with his roommates, it's his house, absolutely. Esther's mentioning that he's older, right? He was the orientation leader. So they met in a context where he was already considered the quote unquote expert of campus, right? In different contexts, a couple of years difference doesn't necessarily make a big difference, but in the context of being new on campus versus understanding what the kind of situation of campus is, it can make a huge difference a few years. Also, Esther mentions it's his house, right? So he has control over the environment. He has control over the drinks. He has control over what happens in that space. And that's a huge amount of power. So we're thinking about those environmental power dynamics. We're thinking about those kind of relational power dynamics. Anything else that kind of stands out to us? I think that those are some of the main ones. Yeah, so that kind of social pressure that Talia might be experiencing, Cole, that kind of pressure to want to fit in, right? So again, we kind of can intuit that Ben is in a situation where he feels socially comfortable, whereas Talia is in a situation where she doesn't know anyone, she doesn't have those social supports, and there's that kind of pressuring going on. Absolutely. I think it's really important to think about power dynamics in our sexual relationship. It's very unlikely that there's never going to be any kind of power differentials between people, but there are ways that we can try to be aware of them. There's ways that we can try to neutralize them. And there's situations where the power differentials are so great that consent piece isn't possible. Yes, I love that someone's mentioning that catch-up piece he's telling her, right? He is nursing a beer while she's drinking shots. So there's also that kind of power difference of potentially someone being more sober than the other person, right? These are all kind of dynamics that can create a situation where there's that kind of dangerous power imbalance. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and Cole mentions that is misleading, right? Yes, the catch-up piece I think is being referred to there. So I think when we're thinking about situations, we want to, as I said, be cognizant of those power pieces. We also want to be cognizant of the way that environments can play a role in this, right? So if a place is crowded and loud and somebody can't communicate as easily, if there's kind of that situation where somebody's kind of feeling like they're pressured into drinking more than they might want to, those can all kind of play a role. I want to then move to some of our bystander tactics, right? This you that arrives at the party and you're overseeing the situation. You know, when we're the you arriving to the party, we don't have all this background information, right? We don't know much about the dynamics between the two, how they met, what the context is. But are there things here that just as a you arriving to the party without being able to know all that background that would still maybe give you pause? The fluttering shut of eyes, the fact that she stumbled, absolutely. So some of those cues that we see that are kind of giving us the sense that she might be at that point where she can no longer kind of think through those decisions as we were talking about before. So even without the kind of background context, we're seeing some signs that could potentially be concerning. So this is where we have that opportunity, right, for bystander intervention. So thinking back to those 3 Ds, that direct approach, that, I actually want to see the chat, the body language, her leaning shows that she's trapped, right? So I love that you're thinking about body language. There's so much we can tell just by looking at how a person's holding their body about whether they're feeling comfortable or not. And again, we might not always be right about that, right? But that can also just kind of tip us off to check in, right? Even if we're not sure, we're thinking that body language looks like they're uncomfortable. It never hurts to just kind of do that check-in piece. So with those 3 Ds, that direct approach, that distract approach, or that delegate approach, what are some ways that this you that arrives at the party could potentially intervene? And feel free to be as creative as possible. What could intervention look like in this context? Ask to join their conversation and go upstairs, right? So like just be that third wheel. I think sometimes there's this negative connotation to being a third wheel, but being a third wheel can be a really, really powerful intervention tactic, right? So kind of inserting yourself into that situation and making sure that you can kind of oversee what's going on. Absolutely. And probably if you insert yourself into it, they're not going to go away upstairs. Any other ways we can potentially intervene in this situation? Give people a minute in the chat because I know sometimes it takes a minute to generate thought. A loud, hey, Ben, just be really happy to see him and interrupt, right? So that's that distract tactic, right? So we're going up to Ben, we're changing the mood, we're kind of engaging him in a conversation. Cole says, make an announcement like a drinking contest. Again, that really easy distract thing. So you're not necessarily having to like call Ben out or like ask Talia what's going on. But instead you're doing something that's going to shift the attention away and give Talia a chance to get out of there, or for you to get Talia out of there. Directly ask if she wants to go home. Give her an out, right? Check in with her. Asking Ben to help with a school assignment, yes. I would love the idea of someone asking for a school assignment in the middle of a party. I think that would, if nothing else, be incredibly distracting. He'd be confused enough to get someone else away. I love it, Berkeley vibes. Yes, so absolutely. Some of those things, I think we're seeing a lot of that direct and that distract approach. What would be a way of delegating here? Is there anyone else potentially at a party that we could delegate to?
Set that invitation. It's a lot of prayer about it.
What's challenging in this situation is that Talia isn't there with friends, right? So maybe in some other situations, we would try to find someone's friends and ask them like, hey, are they okay? But yeah, I love this idea of bringing in a closer friend of Ben's to kind of do that check-in with Ben if we're not feeling comfortable doing so. Like maybe we don't feel like we know Ben enough, but finding someone else that could be like, hey, you need to check in with Ben, like something sketch is going on right now. Absolutely, maybe one of the other people who lives there. So we talked earlier about how we want to necessarily find someone else with a little more power, like a roommate who also has control over that situation might have a little bit more power to kind of make sure things are going well. When we talk about bystander tactics, I think it's really important to, as I said before, acknowledge those barriers. What could be some barriers to that you actually intervening in this situation? What might stop them from kind of taking that step? Assuming everything will turn out okay, right? Like, oh, this is just like a normal hookup situation, or maybe that they're comfortable with each other and I shouldn't get in the way. Everything's going to be fine. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah. Any other things that could stop someone from intervening here? Not wanting Ben to get mad, right? Like, there's many reasons for that, both for the social ramifications, like I don't want to jeopardize that friendship of calling Ben out, but also like maybe I'm intimidated that Ben getting mad is going to turn that to me, right? Worrying that you'll be perceived as uncool, right? So we have a lot of tropes about people that disrupt potential sexual situations. So feeling like if I'm that person, I'm going to be doing something that is quote unquote uncool, absolutely. Wanting to believe that Ben is a good person, right? And I think that kind of touches back on that idea that sexual violence is something done by that shadowy figure over there. Ben isn't going to do that. We're in the same social circle. I'm being paranoid right now. So not necessarily trusting that gut feeling. I'm really glad you all are bringing these up because I think that in real life, like it's really nice to sit here in a classroom and talk about like, these are the things that we're going to do for bystander intervention. But if we're not talking about why people don't actually do them, then we're not really setting ourselves up for success as people who potentially want to step in and disrupt violence. So let's just kind of go through these one by one. So how could we get over that barrier of assuming that everything is going to turn out okay? Any thoughts about how we can kind of push over that particular barrier? Or are there any of the tactics that could be used to kind of get by that one? For this one, yeah, just knowing how common sexual violence is, like knowing that those numbers are there, knowing that the odds are not necessarily in the favor. And again, as Cole's saying, educating yourself. So having that context of knowing this 1 in 4 number, I think can help to say like, it very well may turn out okay, but I don't want to default to that. So just kind of having that background knowledge. Also, I think just knowing that we can ask, right? So one of those direct approaches is just asking like, hey, is everything okay here? If we don't know if everything is okay, like let's check in. Getting over that thing where we have to make an assumption and instead asking someone, right? Giving Talia that chance to say, actually, no, like, I want to get out of here. Right, better safe than sorry. What about this concern that Ben is going to get mad? If we're worried that like it's going to escalate the situation and it's going to bring violence closer to us, is there any way we can kind of get past that? And I want to kind of emphasize like safety concerns are real when it comes to intervention. Like we want to prioritize safety when we're intervening. Are there ways that we can still do this in a safe way? If he's planning this out, someone says in the chat, you probably don't want to be close friends with him anyway. So not worrying that he's going to be mad at you, like not worrying about the social consequences of that. Jessica's also saying, make sure that you have people by who know where you are and are actually nearby. So kind of that safety in numbers piece. And I think that's where delegation, having that strength in numbers, can be a kind of safety measure. It can also help kind of diffuse that anger being directed solely towards us. And if we're thinking back to that distract technique, if we're doing a distraction, we might not actually get Ben that mad, right? He might just be like, oh, you need help with homework. This is very weird. Or as you're saying at Berkeley, perhaps not weird at all. But it kind of may diffuse that from being a situation where someone's angry and just being a situation where someone can get out of there. I'm trying to look at what some of the other ones were. So I think, again, worrying that you're going to be perceived as uncool, that is a very real fear that like we're breaking some kind of social contract if we speak up. Again, I think sometimes just turning to the person next to you and being like, do you see what I'm seeing? And both kind of validating for each other, like, yeah, this is a bit weird, can be a way of kind of getting over that fear because you've had that validation from another person. And finally, just that barrier of wanting to believe that, you know, this doesn't happen in our social spheres. I think that, again, that is a very real one, but just knowing those statistics, knowing the likelihood that when sexual violence occurs, that it's going to be in the context of an acquaintance or someone we know can help us combat that. Absolutely. So I really appreciate you guys kind of indulging me with this scenario. And I think that this is something where we will all have opportunities in big and small ways to intervene. So as you're in a situation where there's potentially a chance to intervene, if you feel those barriers coming up for you, you know, I think it's useful to kind of think through what are some of our options here. What are some ways we could do this that is both safe and comfortable and within my comfort zone? So beyond bystander intervention, I really want to think a little bit more about kind of a proactive approach, right? Because bystander intervention is usually happening after something has already kind of, the wheels have already started turning, something is already going on. But how do we kind of avoid a situation from happening entirely? And a lot of the work I do in prevention is really focused on this culture shift, right? It's on not just saying like, we want to stop something once it started happening, but create better communities where this isn't something that's happening at all. So I have some ideas about how we create this kind of culture of consent, but I'd also love to hear from you all afterwards. If you have other ideas about how we create these more consensual communities. I think the first thing is just normalizing boundary setting, right? So if somebody, for example, is setting a boundary that they don't love PDA, like they don't really want to kiss you in public, they're fine kissing you in private, but like they're just not a public person, responding positively to that, saying, thank you for telling me, right? Instead of kind of having a negative response to that boundary setting, where we're getting upset with them for setting that boundary or we're taking it personally. Because when we kind of have that negative response to boundary setting, we're making it harder for people to assert their boundaries in other contexts. So kind of just normalizing that, I think, is a really good thing to do when we're outside of those sexual contexts. The next piece, and this is kind of a piece that is ongoing, that takes work, that is something that we have to reflect about kind of throughout our lives, which is trying to recognize the power dynamics that exist in our relationships and do what we can to neutralize them. As I said earlier, it's very unlikely that there will be no power dynamics in play. Like we all have different kind of areas in our life where we have additional power. And that's not an inherently bad thing. It's what do we do with that power and how do we neutralize those negative effects of power? As we saw in that scenario, power can come from a lot of places. It can be situational, right? Like specific to you having control over the house that you're in. It could be positional, being that leader over someone at an orientation. It could be some aspect of our identity that gives us additional power in a situation. So just being willing to kind of interrogate those power imbalances and to do what we can to try to make sure that we're sharing power with people in all of our relationships, but also most especially in those sexual relationships that we have. And recognizing that there are certain power dynamics that will never lead to consensual interactions, right? If you have power over someone's grades, if you have power over someone's paycheck, you're probably not going to be able to be in a consensual situation with them. Another thing we can do is just normalize that checking in process that we talked about earlier, right? both with partners, with friends, with family, checking in to make sure that they're comfortable. With sexual partners, I think it can be really great to talk about your needs, your wants, your boundaries, and your deal breakers, right? So a need is something you have to be comfortable in that relationship. A want is going to be something that would be really great to have, but it's optional, right? Like you don't have to have it, but it would be really, really nice if you had that. I like to think of negotiables as things that are like if then, like if this happened, then I could be okay with this, but it's not ideal. And finally, deal breakers are those things like absolutely not, this is a red flag. I don't want anything to do with this. So talking with partners about those 4 elements can be a really great way of just engaging in some of that boundary discussion, especially if you're doing that before we're having sex, right? If we know what makes someone comfortable and uncomfortable before we're having sex, that kind of sets the stage to have that ongoing consent during sexual situations. Another piece of kind of creating these consensual environments is educating ourselves, right, and others. Like a lot of you, when we were talking about bystander interventions, that just kind of like knowing these statistics helps us know to intervene, right? If we have that knowledge about when and how this happens and how it doesn't happen, right, we can kind of better equip ourselves to be responsive and also to prioritize consent as an important thing. So not only just kind of keeping this information to yourself, but being willing to share it with other people in your life, right? And committing to that process of continuing to interrogate those power dynamics, continuing to learn about consensual practices. I don't think you're ever done learning about these things. Like, even though I engage in this work daily, I am still learning new things about this daily. I also think that the cultural conversation about consent keeps getting more nuanced and better each year. So it's something that we want to stay on top of, that we want to keep kind of updating ourselves on. Going along with that, and knowing that there's so many rape myths that are prevalent, you know, we touched on one today, this stranger danger myth, but there are so many myths about how sexual violence happens. So learning about those, and then when you encounter bad information, when you hear a friend saying something that is a rape myth, being willing to kind of counter it with correct information. And that doesn't have to be done in a way that's shaming someone, because we all exist in a society where we're getting not necessarily the perfect information, but doing it in a way that kind of gives a counterpoint, that kind of gives someone another perspective, can be really impactful. Again, if we're thinking back to that pyramid of violence, if we're able to kind of dispel some of those norms that uphold rape culture at that bottom of the pyramid, if we're able to kind of counter some of that, we actually really can change our social spheres to be less accepting of violence in general, of objectification and of oppression. And finally, I think the last piece that I never want to go without saying is just believing and supporting survivors of sexual violence, right? So because of that 1 in 4 number that we talked about earlier, it's really likely that you're going to know people in your lifetime that have experienced sexual violence. So the way we talk about sexual violence matters, because if somebody overhears us, if a friend overhears us talking about it in a way that is not supportive, that makes it harder for them to get support and to disclose if they've experienced it. So even though we're probably going to know a lot of people, that doesn't mean that people are always going to share that experience with us. So we just want to assume that we're probably likely in the presence of someone who has an experience with sexual violence when we're in large groups. If somebody ever does disclose sexual violence to you, there's some best practices for how to respond to that. I think it's always good measure to thank someone for telling them, to underscore that you believe them. And you don't have to explicitly say it. You can say it with your actions and with the things that you are and aren't saying. If they bring up kind of those self-blame things that are really typical for survivors to do, because we have so much societal messaging about blame being placed on survivors, letting them know that it is not their fault that this happened to them, and offering support in a way that is still empowering, right? I've talked a lot about how sexual violence is about power and control, somebody kind of exerting power and control over someone else. So when people experience sexual violence, it's really common for them to feel like they have lost control of their situation. So as friends, as support people, we want to do whatever we can to kind of put that control and that power back in their hands. So what that can look like is offering support, offering options, but we don't want to tell people what to do next. We don't want to say, okay, we're getting in the car, we're going to the hospital, we're going to the police station. We don't want to do that, right? Because those options might not be right for that person. Instead, we could say, hey, I know these great resources. Do any of these resources sound like things you want right now, or would you rather just kind of have some company? giving them those options, keeping that power and control in their hands is super, super important as we kind of believe and support survivors. I think it's also important to think about what we don't say, right? When we're talking about believing survivors, it's also about avoiding questions that imply blame. So why were you with that person? Why were you drinking? Why were you out that late? Any kind of questions that imply blame are ways of really not supporting a survivor. So instead, the only kind of questions we want to be asking are, how can I support you? What do you need right now? And if anyone has any questions about how to support a survivor, I'm happy to answer those as well. Any other ideas before we move on about ways that we can build these consensual communities where we don't even need to get to the place of having to do bystander intervention because everybody agrees that on good consent practices? Any other kind of proactive approaches that we should be considering?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And we move on, but if anyone has any, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be happy to share them out. Because as I said, this is a list that could keep going. This is not finite in any way, shape, or form. There's about 1 million ways that we can kind of build that culture change. And, you know, these are kind of incremental, right? By having one conversation with one person about boundary setting, that's creating a small change in that relationship. And the hope is that that has a trickle effect, right? If we normalize this in one relationship, in one social sphere, that's going to kind of trickle out to other social contexts, to other people's relationships. And that's how we do it. We do it kind of person by person as a way of kind of shifting the norms around sexual violence. So now in the time we have left, I'm just going to see if anyone has any broad questions. These can be questions about sexual violence. They can be questions about intervention or prevention. I will be happy to answer any that I have the answer to. And if I don't have the answer, I'll be happy to kind of get back to you with that information. I also put my contact information here. So if anyone has questions later, you're welcome to always send me an email about that.
Okay, I am going to wrap up here. There were a couple of questions for Jackie, but just in the interest of time, we've had some good conversation today. You had a chance to watch the whole lecture. I'm going to give you guys just about 5 minutes now because you've been at it continuously since the class started. When you come back, what we're going to do is have you join the link that Jillian sent you. So if all of you can check your email for the link to the discussion groups. When you return, we're going to play part of a video for you. It's about a 25-minute long video, and then that will be the trigger for you to move into your discussion groups. And so the discussion groups today will take you right to the end of the class period at 5:30, so we won't come back for a debrief. But please make sure that all of you post at the end of your discussion group. There's a couple of questions we're going to ask you to discuss together when you move into the group. So when you come back in about 5 minutes, I'll see you on the link that you received from Jillian today, and then I'll orient you to the film and then the discussion group that follows. Okay, I'll see you at 4:35.